The calf was dying. Charlotte's hands had gone numb an hour ago, but she couldn't drop the lantern. Not now. Not when Elias was elbow deep inside the cow, fighting to turn a breech berth in sub-zero darkness. One slip and they'd lose everything. This wasn't supposed to be her life. 3 months ago, she'd been drinking tea in Boston. Now she was bleeding into frozen straw, watching a man she'd lied to save an animal she didn't know existed before September. If you want to know how two liars built an empire from frozen dirt, stay until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this story travels. The train lurched to a stop, and Charlotte Whitmore's stomach dropped with it. Through the smudged window, she could see what passed for a train station in Cutter's Ridge, Montana territory. A leaning platform of weathered boards, a rusted water tower, and absolutely nothing else. No brick buildings, no gas lamps, no people, except for 3 men standing in the wind like fence posts, their hats pulled low against the dust. One of them had to be Elias Boone. Charlotte's hands trembled as she gathered her skirts. The green silk dress had seemed appropriate when she'd left Boston. Elegant but practical. The kind of thing a refined woman would wear to meet her future husband. Now, looking at the endless brown nothing outside the window, she realized she'd dressed for the wrong wedding entirely. "Last stop, ma'am." The conductor appeared beside her seat, his expression pitying. He'd seen her luggage, seen the lace parasol, seen the little hat with the decorative bird perched on top. He knew exactly what she was. Mail-order bride. The words tasted like copper in her mouth. "Thank you." Charlotte stood, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the door with her chin up. She'd learned that much from her mother before the money ran out. Never let them see you break. The Montana wind hit her like a fist. It wasn't the gentle autumn breeze of New England. This was something alive and mean, full of grit that stung her eyes and whipped her carefully pinned hair loose in seconds. Her parasol inverted immediately, the delicate lace ripping with a sound like tearing silk. Charlotte stood on the platform, holding the ruined parasol, while dust devils spun across the valley and her hat tumbled away into the scrub brush. The 3 men hadn't moved. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The voice came from the tallest one, broad-shouldered, weather-beaten, wearing a coat that had seen better years and a hat that had seen better decades. His face was hard to read, shadowed under the brim, but Charlotte caught the flash of something in his eyes when he took in her dress, her ruined parasol, her 4 leather trunks being unloaded behind her. Disappointment. She knew the look. She'd seen it on her father's face when the bank took the house, on her brother's face when she'd told him she was going west, on her own face every morning in the mirror for the past 6 months. "Mr. Boone," she extended her hand, grateful it wasn't shaking. "It's Miss Whitmore, actually. We're not married yet." "Right." He took her hand briefly. His grip was warm despite the cold, rough with calluses. "Elias, this is Jack Brennan and Tom Wu. They help with the cattle." The other 2 men touched their hat brims but didn't speak. Jack was younger, maybe 20, with a crooked nose and nervous energy. Tom was older, Chinese, with eyes that missed nothing. Neither of them looked surprised by what they were seeing. They'd expected this. "Your letters said you knew ranching," Elias said. It wasn't quite an accusation, but it wasn't quite a question either. Charlotte's face went hot. "I said I was willing to learn ranching, that I came from hardy stock and wasn't afraid of hard work." "You said your family had agricultural interests in Vermont." "We did. My uncle had a small farm. I visited twice as a child." The lie sat between them like something dead. "I may have simplified some details." "Simplified?" Elias looked at her trunks again. "How many dresses did you bring?" "That's hardly—" "How many?" 14. Charlotte lifted her chin. "But several are quite practical. And I brought books on animal husbandry and crop rotation and books." Something that might have been a laugh died in Elias's throat. "Tom, get the wagon." The ride to the ranch took 2 hours and felt like crossing into another country. The road, if it could be called that, was barely more than wheel ruts across open grassland. Mountains rose in the west, already white with early snow. To the north and south, nothing but rolling prairie that went on until the earth curved away. No houses, no barns, no signs of human life except the occasional fence post leaning drunk against the wind. Charlotte sat in the back of the wagon, surrounded by her trunks, while Elias drove in silence. Jack and Tom had stayed in town. She didn't ask why. She was starting to understand that out here, words were rationed like everything else. "How far is the ranch?" she finally asked. "Another hour." "And the nearest neighbor?" "Brennan's place. 6 miles south." 6 miles. Charlotte had walked 6 blocks to church every Sunday in Boston. 6 miles might as well be China. What about the town? If I needed supplies, or Cutter's Ridge is the town. What you saw at the station, that's it. General store, saloon, boarding house. 43 people last census. We go in once a month if the weather holds. Once a month. Charlotte looked down at her hands, still soft despite everything. The white gloves were already stained with dust. Your letters made it sound more, established. Did they? It wasn't a question. You said you had a prosperous ranch with modern conveniences, that you were looking for a partner, not a servant, that you valued education and refinement. Elias was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat. My ranch is 40 acres of rock and stubborn grass. The cabin's got 4 rooms if you count the lean-to. Modern conveniences means I built an outhouse instead of digging a latrine. I do value education. I got to 6th grade before my pa died and I had to quit. And refinement? He glanced back at her. Lady, I haven't eaten off a real plate in 3 years. I don't even remember what refinement looks like. The words landed like stones. Then why did you write those letters? Elias turned back to the road. Same reason you wrote yours, I expect. I was lonely and stupid and thought maybe words on paper could be better than the truth. They didn't speak again until the cabin came into view. It wasn't a cabin, it was a shack. 1 story, wooden, with a roof that sagged in the middle and a chimney that listed to the left like a drunk leaning on a bar. The windows, there were 2, had actual glass, which Charlotte supposed was something, but one had a crack sealed with tar paper. The door hung crooked on leather hinges. Behind it, a barn in worse shape and a corral holding 3 cows and a horse that looked older than Charlotte's grandmother. This was it. This was the prosperous ranch with modern conveniences. Charlotte felt something crack inside her chest. I'll get your trunks, Elias said, climbing down. You should go inside. Fire's probably dead by now, but there's kindling in the box. She didn't move. Miss Whitmore, I can't do this. The words came out small and broken. I'm sorry. I thought I could, but I can't. This isn't... I didn't... Elias stood beside the wagon, looking up at her with those unreadable eyes. You want to go back? I don't know. Maybe. Charlotte pressed her hands to her face. She would not cry. She had not cried when her father's business collapsed, when they lost the house, when her brother told her she couldn't stay with his family because his wife didn't approve. She would not cry now over a crooked cabin in Montana. But she was crying anyway. The next train east comes through Friday, Elias said quietly. 4 days. You can stay here till then, or I can put you up at the boarding house in town. Your choice. Charlotte looked at him through tears. Just like that? Just like that. I won't keep you somewhere you don't want to be. He pulled one of her trunks toward the edge of the wagon. But you should know, the boarding house costs $2 a night, and the train ticket back to Boston runs about $45, maybe more depending on routing. $45. Charlotte had $17.30 to her name, every cent she'd had left after paying for the ticket west. Elias must have seen it in her face because he nodded slowly. That's what I thought. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to stay in the cabin tonight. Tomorrow, you're going to decide if you can stand living here for a while, or if you'd rather take your chances in Cutter's Ridge washing dishes at the boarding house until you can afford a ticket somewhere else. Either way, I won't force you into anything, but I'd appreciate a decision before Friday, because if you're leaving, I need to know so I can figure out what comes next. He lifted the trunk like it weighed nothing and carried it toward the cabin. Charlotte sat in the wagon, watching him go. The wind had picked up again, bringing the smell of coming rain. In the distance, lightning flickered over the mountains. She thought about Boston, about her brother's cramped apartment and his wife's disapproving stares, about the friend who'd suggested mail-order marriage like it was a reasonable solution instead of a desperate gamble, about the letters she'd written, full of lies about her hardy constitution and practical skills and enthusiasm for frontier life. She'd come here because she had nowhere else to go. That was still true. Charlotte climbed down from the wagon and followed Elias inside. The cabin was worse than the outside suggested. One main room with a dirt floor, actual dirt, packed down and stained dark from years of boots and spills. A stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, cold now, full of dead ash. A rough wooden table with 2 chairs, neither of which matched. A shelf holding tin plates, cups, and a single frying pan. A corner with a straw tick mattress on a wooden frame. That was it. That was everything. Bedrooms through there. Elias pointed to a doorway covered with a blanket instead of a door. I'll sleep out here. Charlotte stepped through the blanket into a room barely big enough for the iron bedstead it contained. A washstand. A trunk at the foot of the bed. One window, cracked, stuffed with rags around the edges. She could see daylight through gaps in the wallboards. It's cold, she heard herself say. Winter hasn't even started yet. Elias was doing something with the fireplace, building a new fire from the ashes. Gets down to 30 below come January. You'll want to keep something heavy over that window, and we'll need to seal those wall gaps with mud and straw before the real freeze hits. 30 below. Charlotte had never experienced anything colder than the bitter March wind off Boston Harbor. I don't know how to seal walls with mud, she said. I'll teach you. I don't know how to start a fire without kindling. I'll teach you that too. I don't know how to cook on an open hearth or milk a cow or do any of the things your letters said you needed. Charlotte's voice was rising despite herself. I don't even know how to keep a fire going overnight. I'm going to freeze to death in my sleep and you'll find me dead in the morning, and then what? You'll be out a bride and $45 and stuck with 14 impractical dresses. Elias turned from this fireplace. The kindling had caught, small flames licking up around the larger wood. You know how to read. What? Your letters. They were well written, proper spelling, good penmanship. That means you had education, real education, not just 6th grade and done. He stood, dusting ash from his hands. Can you do numbers? Of course I can do. Can you read a seed catalog and calculate yield ratios? Can you keep account books? Can you write letters to merchants that don't make us sound like ignorant farmers who'll accept any price? Charlotte blinked. Yes. I managed my father's household accounts for 3 years before we lost everything. Then you're not useless. Elias moved to the shelves, pulling down the tin plates. You're just trained for the wrong things. Out here, that's not fatal, just inconvenient. He said it so matter-of-factly, like retraining a Boston socialite to survive Montana winters was no more complicated than teaching a horse to pull a different cart. I burned water once, Charlotte said. Elias paused. How do you burn water? I don't know. I was trying to boil eggs and somehow the pot caught fire and there was smoke everywhere and the cook had to throw the whole thing outside. The memory still humiliated her. That's when my mother stopped letting me in the kitchen. You had a cook? We had 3. And a housekeeper. And a groundskeeper for the garden. Charlotte looked around the dirt floor cabin. I've never cooked a meal in my life. I've never cleaned anything more complicated than a writing desk. I've certainly never worked with livestock or crops or any of the things you actually need. Elias set the plates on the table. You ever been hungry? Real hungry, not just waiting for dinner to be served? The question caught her off guard. Yes. After the collapse. Before I came here. There were days when Then you'll learn. He moved to the shelves again, pulling down a cloth sack. Hunger's a good teacher, so's cold. So's necessity. He dumped beans into a pot, added water from a bucket, and hung the whole thing over the fire on an iron hook. This is beans. We eat them 3 times a day because they're cheap and they keep. Sometimes we get salt pork. Sometimes fresh meat if hunting goes well. Tonight it's just beans because I wasn't expecting company and didn't prepare anything special. You weren't expecting... Charlotte stared at him. You didn't know I was coming today? Got your telegram last week saying you'd arrive mid-September. Didn't say which day exactly. Elias pulled a blackened pan from the shelf. Figured I'd check the station every few days until you showed up. Today was lucky. Lucky. Charlotte watched him mix what appeared to be flour and lard and water in a bowl, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. What are you making? Biscuits. Or trying to. I'm not great at them, but they're better than nothing. He shaped the dough into rough lumps and placed them in the pan. You can learn this too. It's not fancy cooking like your mother's kitchen. It's just fuel, calories to keep you alive another day. The words should have been depressing. Instead, something about the plainness of them steadied Charlotte's breathing. Just fuel, just survival. Nothing elegant or refined or impossible. Maybe she could do that. Can I help? She asked. Elias looked surprised. You want to? I want to learn. You said hunger's a good teacher. I'd rather learn before I'm desperate. Charlotte moved closer to the fire, grateful for its warmth. What do I do? He hesitated, then handed her a wooden spoon. Stir the beans, not constantly, just every few minutes so they don't stick to the bottom. When they start bubbling, pull them back from the direct heat, but keep them warm. Charlotte took the spoon and knelt beside the fire. The heat felt good on her face. The beans smelled like nothing, just wet and starchy. She stirred them carefully, watching the water start to simmer. Like this? That's fine. Elias placed the pan of biscuits on a flat stone near the coals. They'll take about 20 minutes, maybe 30. When they're brown on top and sound hollow, if you tap them, they're done. They worked in silence, if it could be called work. Charlotte stirred beans and watched biscuits while Elias moved around the cabin, lighting a kerosene lamp as the light outside failed, bringing in more wood for the fire, checking the windows. Thunder rumbled in the distance. The first drops of rain pattered on the roof. It leaks, Elias said, pointing to a bucket positioned near the door. Not bad, but enough to be annoying. I've got tar paper to fix it, just haven't had time. I could help with that too. He looked at her kneeling by the fire in her green silk dress, already stained with ash and dust. You're going to ruin those fancy clothes. They're already ruined. Montana destroyed them the moment I stepped off the train. Charlotte stirred the beans again. They were bubbling now, starting to soften. I brought 14 dresses because I thought I'd need them for social calls and church services and whatever Frontier Society does. I was imagining tea parties, maybe a dance or two. There's a dance, Elias said. Once a year, at harvest time. Everyone comes. Last year, 46 people showed up from all over the valley. 46 people, for the entire social calendar. Charlotte laughed, and it came out slightly hysterical. I brought 3 ball gowns. You can sell them in town. Mrs. Chen at the boarding house has connections. She can probably get you $10, maybe $15 for the fancy ones. $15 for a dress that costs $60. But $15 was $15, and Charlotte was learning fast that out here, mathematics mattered more than sentiment. I'll think about it. She pulled the bean pot back from the flames like he'd shown her. Are these done? Elias checked them. Close enough. Biscuits are ready too. He pulled the pan from the fire using a rag, tapping one of the biscuits. It sounded hollow. Not my best work, but they'll do. They ate at the rough table, beans and biscuits on tin plates, water from tin cups. No napkins. No silverware beyond a single spoon each. The beans were bland and mushy. The biscuits were dense and vaguely burned on the bottom. Charlotte had eaten 7-course dinners that were less satisfying. It's good, she said. It's terrible. But thank you for lying. Elias broke his biscuit apart using the pieces to scoop beans. Tomorrow I'll show you how to make them properly. The trick is not overworking the dough. I always overwork it. Tomorrow. Charlotte tested the word. So you're assuming I'm staying? I'm assuming you'll stay until Friday, at least. After that, he shrugged. Your choice. They finished eating in silence. Outside, the rain picked up, drumming hard on the roof. Water dripped steadily into the bucket by the door. The fire crackled and popped. In Boston, Charlotte would be dressing for dinner right now. Real dinner, with courses and conversation, and her mother's friends discussing the symphony season. Instead, she was sitting on a rough wooden chair in a dirt floor cabin in Montana, eating burned biscuits with a stranger she'd promised to marry. And somehow, impossibly, she wasn't as miserable as she should have been. I should clean up, she said, standing. Leave it. I'll handle it in the morning. Elias stood too, moving to the fireplace to bank the coals for the night. You should rest. It's been a long day. Charlotte looked toward the blanket-covered doorway to the bedroom. The reality of the situation was starting to settle in her bones. Mr. Boone. Elias. Elias. She took a breath. I need you to understand something. I came here because I had no other options. My family lost everything. My brother made it clear I wasn't welcome. I had $17 and no prospects. Marriage seemed like the only solution, even to a stranger, even in Montana. So I lied in my letters. I lied about my skills and my experience and my enthusiasm for frontier life. I lied because I was desperate and I thought lies were all I had to offer. Elias turned from the fire. In the lamplight, his face looked older than his years, tired, weathered, marked by too much sun and wind and disappointment. I lied too, he said quietly. I made this place sound better than it is because I was lonely and I thought a woman wouldn't come if she knew the truth. I don't have a prosperous ranch. I have 40 acres of nothing and debt I'm fighting to pay down. I'm not educated or refined. I'm just a man who works until his hands bleed and still barely gets by. He paused. So if we're confessing, there it is. We both lied. We're both desperate. And now we're stuck together in a cabin that leaks. Charlotte felt something loosen in her chest. At least we're honest about it now. At least there's that. They looked at each other across the small cabin, two strangers who'd gambled everything on pretty words and false promises. 4 days, Charlotte said. I'll give it 4 days. I'll learn what I can, and on Friday, I'll decide whether to stay or find another solution. Fair enough? Elias moved toward the door to check the night latch. And Miss Whitmore? For what it's worth, I hope you stay. Not because I need a wife, I've managed alone this long, but because I think you're tougher than you believe. And tough is the only thing that survives out here. He said it like a fact, not a compliment. Charlotte went to bed that night in a room with gaps in the walls, in a bed that smelled like straw and strangers, listening to rain leak through the roof and thunder roll across the valley. She should have been terrified. She should have been crying into the thin pillow, regretting every decision that brought her here. Instead, she was thinking about beans and biscuits and the calluses starting to form on Elias Boone's hands. 4 days. She could survive 4 days. Maybe. Morning came with roosters she didn't know existed. Charlotte woke to the sound of something screaming outside her window, a horrible, mechanical shriek that shot her upright in bed with her heart hammering. It took 3 full seconds to realize it was a chicken, an actual chicken, announcing dawn like it was personally offended by the sun. First time's always the worst, Elias called from the other room. You get used to it. Charlotte seriously doubted that. She dressed in the least fancy dress she'd brought, a gray cotton work dress that her maid back in Boston would have worn for scrubbing floors. It felt strange putting it on herself, doing the buttons without help. The mirror over the washstand showed a woman who looked nothing like Charlotte Whitmore of Beacon Hill. Her hair was tangled from sleep, her face pale without powder, her hands already showing the first signs of yesterday's work. Good, she thought. That other Charlotte didn't survive here anyway. Elias had breakfast waiting, more beans, reheated from last night, and something that might have been coffee if you squinted hard and had low standards. It's chicory mostly, he admitted, pouring her a cup. Real coffee is expensive. This is what we drink. It tasted like burnt dirt. Charlotte drank it anyway because it was hot and she was cold, and she needed to prove something, to him or to herself, she wasn't sure. Today's plan, Elias said, sitting across from her. Feeding routine first. You need to learn the animals. Then we'll work on the garden, what's left of it before winter. After that, I'll show you food preservation. We've got a root cellar that needs stocking, and if we don't get it done before the freeze, we'll starve come February. That's cheerful. That's reality. He finished his coffee in one long swallow. Out here, winter doesn't care about your feelings. You prepare or you die. Those are the options. Charlotte set down her cup. Then teach me how to prepare. They started with the chickens. There were 8 of them, living in a coop that leaned more than the cabin. Elias showed her how to scatter feed, how to check for eggs, how to recognize when a hen was sick versus when she was just being temperamental. This one's Bess. He pointed to a rust-colored bird with an attitude problem. She's mean. Don't turn your back on her. You named them? Some of them. Gets boring talking to myself all day. He moved to the next hen. That's Mabel. She's the best layer, and the black one's Henrietta. She's old, but I don't have the heart to cull her yet. Charlotte watched him handle the birds with surprising gentleness, his rough hands checking them over for mites and injuries. You care about them. They keep me alive. Eggs are protein. Protein survival. He glanced at her. You'll need to learn to butcher eventually. Chickens first, then larger animals. Can you handle that? The thought of killing something with her own hands made Charlotte's stomach turn, but she nodded anyway because what choice did she have? Next came the cows. This is Rosie. Elias patted the flank of a red-brown cow with gentle eyes. She's our dairy, 2 gallons a day if you treat her right. That's milk, butter, cheese if you know how to make it. I don't. I'll teach you. He grabbed a wooden stool and a pail. Watch first. Charlotte watched him milk the cow with efficient, rhythmic pulls, the white streams hitting the pail with a sound like rain on tin. It looked simple. Deceptively simple. Your turn. She sat on the stool, positioned the pail, and reached for the cow's udder. Rosie immediately shifted, nearly knocking Charlotte sideways. She knows you're nervous, Elias said from behind her. Cows can tell. You have to be confident. I'm sitting under a 1,000-pound animal trying to squeeze milk from parts I've never even thought about before. Confidence is in short supply. Fake it. Charlotte took a breath and tried again. This time she got a weak stream of milk, barely a trickle. Then nothing. Then Rosie kicked the bucket over entirely, spilling what little Charlotte had managed to collect. That's normal, Elias said, righting the bucket. Took me 2 weeks to get the hang of it. You've got 4 days? 2 hours later, Charlotte had managed to produce maybe half a cup of usable milk. Her hands were cramping, and Rosie looked personally insulted by the entire experience. That's enough for today, Elias said, taking over and filling the pail in minutes. You'll get better. Will I? Charlotte stood, rubbing her aching hands. Every finger felt like it had been twisted in a vice. You will or you'll starve. Turns out that's motivating. He said it without cruelty, just simple fact. Charlotte was starting to understand that out here, everything was simple fact. There was no room for delicacy or cushioned truths. They worked through the morning, checking fence posts, hauling water from the creek, inspecting what remained of the garden. Charlotte learned the difference between winter squash and summer squash, between carrots that were ready to harvest and carrots that needed another week. Her back ached, her hands blistered. The sun beat down despite the cold wind, and she could feel her skin burning under the autumn glare. We need to get you a hat, Elias said, noticing her red face. And proper boots. Those city shoes won't last a month. Charlotte looked down at her leather button-ups, already scuffed and stained. Add it to the list of things I can't afford. I've got credit at the general store. We'll go to town tomorrow, get you outfitted properly. He pulled another winter squash from the vine. Consider it an investment. If you stay, you'll need them. If you don't, you can take them with you. If you stay. The words hung in the air between them. Lunch was, predictably, beans. This time with salt pork and an onion, which Charlotte had to admit made them significantly better. She was starting to understand why Elias ate them 3 times a day. They were cheap, filling, and hard to completely ruin. This afternoon preserving, Elias said, scraping his plate clean. I've got vegetables that need canning before they spoil, and you need to learn the process. It's exacting work. Mess it up and you'll poison us come January. No pressure. Actually, yes pressure. That's the whole point of canning. It took Charlotte a moment to realize he'd made a joke. The afternoon was spent in the lean-to kitchen, if it could be called that. Really just an extension of the cabin with a work table and shelves for storage. Elias showed her how to prepare jars, how to pack vegetables, how to process them in boiling water to create the seal that would keep food safe through winter. Temperature matters, he explained, checking the water with his finger. Too cool, and it won't seal. Too hot, and the jars crack. You have to learn to read it. Read water. Read everything. Weather, animals, plants, fire. Out here, you're always reading something. He handed her a jar. Try this one. Charlotte lowered the jar into the boiling water, watching it carefully. The glass was hot against her fingers, even through the towel. Steam rose around her face. For a moment, she was back in Boston, watching the cook prepare preserves while she sat at the kitchen table pretending to help. The memory felt like something from another life. That's good, Elias said, checking her work. You're a fast learner when you focus. I'm a desperate learner. There's a difference. Not really. Desperation's just focus with higher stakes. They worked until dark, processing squash and carrots and the last of the green beans. Charlotte's hands were raw from the hot water. Her back ached from bending over the table, and she smelled like vinegar and vegetables. But the shelves were full now, rows of sealed jars that glinted in the lamplight like amber bottles of survival. "That'll help," Elias said, surveying their work. "Not enough for the whole winter, but it's a start." Dinner was, shockingly, not beans. Elias produced 2 fresh trout from somewhere, probably the creek, and fried them in the pan with a bit of lard. They ate with their fingers, picking the bones clean, and Charlotte thought it might be the best meal she'd ever had. "Tomorrow town," Elias said, tossing the bones into the fire. "We'll get you outfitted, pick up supplies, and I need to talk to the banker about extending my loan payment. Should take most of the day." "You're in debt," Charlotte said. "Not a question. Bought this land 3 years ago with money I didn't have. Been paying it off since." He stared into the fire. "Some years are better than others. This year's been tough. Drought killed half my crops, lost 2 calves to wolves. If next year's the same—" He didn't finish the sentence. Charlotte understood anyway. One more bad year and Elias Boone would lose everything: the cabin, the land, the animals, everything he'd built, just like her father. "Is that why you wanted a wife?" she asked quietly. "Extra hands to help save the ranch?" "Partly." He was quiet for a long moment. "Mostly I was just tired of being alone. Tired of talking to chickens and having nobody talk back. Thought maybe a partner would make the work less." He gestured vaguely. "Less everything." "I'm not sure I can save your ranch," Charlotte said. "I can barely milk a cow." "I'm not asking you to save anything. I'm asking if you can stand living here, learning here, being here. The rest we'll figure out as we go." They sat in silence, listening to the fire crackle and the wind pick up outside. Charlotte thought about Boston, about her brother's wife saying there wasn't room for another person in their small apartment. About her father's funeral, attended by creditors and former friends who wouldn't meet her eyes. About having nowhere else to go. "I'll stay," she heard herself say. Elias looked at her sharply. "You sure? You've still got 2 days before the train." "I'm sure." Charlotte surprised herself by meaning it. "I'm not good at any of this yet. I'll probably continue to be terrible at it for a while, but I can learn. And I'd rather learn here than go back to Boston and beg my brother for charity he doesn't want to give." That's not exactly a ringing endorsement. It's honest. You said you valued honesty. Elias smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. It changed his whole face, making him look younger, less weathered. "Fair enough. Then we'll make it official when the circuit preacher comes through. Usually sometime in October." Official. Married. Properly. He stood, moving to bank the fire for the night. "Unless you'd rather wait, make sure you can stand me first." Charlotte thought about it. Really thought about it. She barely knew this man. He'd lied in his letters, lived in a leaking cabin, and ate beans 3 times a day. He was rough, taciturn, and his idea of romance was teaching her how to seal jars. But he'd also been patient when she failed at milking. He'd given her honest work instead of false comfort. He'd offered her a choice when he could have just demanded she stay. "October's fine," she said. That night, Charlotte lay in bed listening to the wind howl across the prairie and thought about the future. Not the future she'd imagined when she'd left Boston, comfortable, refined, safe. The actual future, full of hard work and uncertainty and the constant battle against a land that didn't care whether she survived. She thought about Elias Boone in the next room, probably not sleeping either, both of them lying awake in the dark wondering if they'd made another terrible mistake. 4 days had become forever. Charlotte closed her eyes and tried not to think about how many ways this could go wrong. The town of Cutter's Ridge looked worse in daylight than Charlotte remembered from the train platform. Worse, and also somehow more real. The buildings, 7 of them, if you counted the structures leaning against the main ones for support, sat in a line like teeth in a jaw someone had punched. The main street was mud-rutted with wagon wheels. Everything was the color of dust. "Welcome to civilization," Elias said, tying the wagon to a post outside the general store. Charlotte climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from 2 hours in the wagon. She'd worn the gray work dress, figuring it was already ruined and wouldn't get worse. The boots Elias had lent her, enormous things that swallowed her feet, at least kept the mud from reaching her skin. The general store was larger than she'd expected, though larger was relative. Inside, shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from canned goods to rope to ammunition. A woman stood behind the counter, probably mid-50s, with iron gray hair and sharp eyes that assessed Charlotte in one sweeping glance. "So you're the bride," the woman said, not unkindly. "Charlotte." She extended her hand. "And yes, apparently I am. Margaret Chen, my husband Tom helped bring you out from the station." She had a firm handshake. "I heard you were a Boston girl. That took guts coming all this way." "Or desperation," Charlotte said. Margaret laughed. A real laugh, not polite society laughter. "Desperation's what keeps most of us alive out here. Men included, though they won't admit it." She turned to Elias. "I'm assuming you need practical things, not pretty things. Boots, hat, work clothes," Elias said. "She needs to survive the winter." "I also need a parasol," Charlotte heard herself say. "The one I had was ruined on my first day." "Parasol?" Margaret raised her eyebrows. "That's not survival." "No, but it's sanity." Charlotte met her eyes. "I'm going to be learning how to live in conditions I've never experienced. If I can keep the sun off my face while I'm doing it, I'd like to." Something in Margaret's expression shifted. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. "Fair enough. I've got some sturdy ones. You'll like them better than those fancy Boston ones anyway." Over the next 2 hours, Charlotte was transformed. New boots that actually fit, though they felt stiff and foreign on her feet. A hat with a wide brim and a leather band that wouldn't blow off in the wind. 3 work dresses made of heavy cotton that could actually withstand dirt and water. Undergarments designed for practicality instead of appearance. A parasol made of canvas, durable, plain, utterly unadorned. "You look like you belong here now," Margaret said, surveying the results. Charlotte looked at the small mirror Margaret provided and barely recognized herself. The woman looking back was someone new, someone capable, or at least someone who looked capable. That was something. "How much do I owe you?" Elias asked. $37 total. You want to run a tab?" "No, I'll pay." He pulled bills from his pocket. Not many, and Charlotte could see the transaction was painful. $37. That was a month of Elias's profit, probably more. "I can sell my dresses," Charlotte said quickly. "You mentioned that, the fancy ones." Margaret nodded. "I can get you maybe $20 for the lot. I've got connections with women in Denver who will buy them for resale. Take me a couple months to get the money to you, though." "That's acceptable." Charlotte turned to Elias. "That covers most of this." "You're keeping some of that money," he said. "Why?" "Because you might need to leave. I won't trap you here without your own resources." He turned back to Margaret. "Add the dress commission to what we settle later." The banker's office was next, a small brick building that smelled like ink and old wood. The banker, a thin man named Caldwell with suspicious eyes, greeted Elias with the kind of cold civility reserved for debtors. "Mr. Boone, you're early. We weren't expecting you until next week." "I wanted to discuss extending the payment schedule," Elias said, pulling out a worn ledger. "This year's been difficult. The drought killed most of the south pasture. I'd like to discuss a modification." Caldwell's eyes went to Charlotte, then back to Elias. "Your wife, I presume." "Soon to be. We'll be married next month." "That might help your situation." Caldwell opened his own ledger. Leather-bound, professional, intimidating. "You currently owe $840. At your current rate of payment, you'll have it settled in..." He did calculations in his head. 3 years, if you don't miss a payment. If you do, the land is forfeit. $800. Charlotte tried to imagine what that meant. Her Boston house had cost $3,000, but that was when her family had money. "I need more time," Elias said. "Give me 5 years instead of 3. Your interest rate would increase." "I understand." "And the bride? What does she bring to the arrangement? Please tell me this isn't just sentiment." Charlotte felt Elias tense beside her. "She brings labor, and she can help with household accounts and correspondence. That frees me to focus on the work." It was a reasonable explanation. It was also the exact opposite of what Charlotte wanted. She didn't want to be reduced to her economic value, but she also understood that to a banker, a person was nothing but a transaction. "She'll need to sign something indicating she understands the property could be forfeit," Caldwell said. "If you die, Mr. Boone, and she's unable to maintain the payments, she'll lose the land." "She understands." "No, I should hear it from her." Caldwell turned his cold eyes on Charlotte. "Do you understand that you're entering into an arrangement where everything could be taken away? That if your husband dies or fails to pay, you could be homeless and destitute? Charlotte met his gaze. I'm already homeless and destitute. This would at least be temporary. Caldwell smiled, a thin, predatory smile. Good answer. I'll draw up the modification. 5 years, increased interest of 2%. You'll sign, both of you. They walked out of the bank 10 minutes later with a new agreement that seemed to have cost Elias something essential. He was quiet on the walk back to Margaret's store to pick up supplies, quiet in the wagon on the ride home. Charlotte sat beside him, watching the landscape blur past. The mountains were getting closer as they headed west, the peaks already touched with snow. Everything felt larger out here. The sky, the distances, the consequences of every decision. I'm sorry, she said finally. For what? The increased interest. That wouldn't have happened if you didn't have a wife to vouch for. Maybe not. Elias kept his eyes on the road. But I'd still be drowning. At least this way I have 5 years instead of 3. 5 years is a long time to work this hard. It's the only choice I have. They didn't speak again until they were back at the cabin, unloading the supplies. Flour, salt, sugar, coffee, dried beans by the sack, canning supplies, nails, rope, leather for repairs. Charlotte had never seen so much stuff accumulated in one place. It was both overwhelming and strangely comforting, proof that they were preparing, that they were taking this seriously. That night, after they'd organized everything and eaten beans with the addition of fresh bread, Charlotte's first bread, though Elias had to remake it when her first attempt nearly qualified as a weapon, Elias sat by the fire and showed her his accounts. The ledger was handwritten in a careful, laborious script. Each month's expenses and income detailed in full. Money spent on seeds, on repairs, on taxes, income from selling milk and cheese and the occasional cow. The margins were razor thin. In some months, he barely broke even. This is what keeps me awake at night, Elias said, pointing to a column of numbers. 3 bad years in a row and we're finished. 2 bad years and I'll have to sell off livestock just to make payments. How many good years have you had? 1. 2 seasons ago, the weather was perfect and prices were decent. Made enough to pay down some of the original debt. He closed the ledger. Haven't had a year like that since. What would make a year good? Rain at the right time, snow in winter, the kind that melts slow, not all at once in spring floods. No livestock disease. No predators. Prices that don't collapse. He looked at her. Basically, everything would have to go right, and nothing ever does. Charlotte studied the ledger, her mind already moving through possibilities. Can you diversify? Plant different crops, maybe? Something that grows if wheat doesn't? I've got some squash and beans for eating, but for sale, wheat's what works this far north. What about chickens? You have 8. What if you increase that? Eggs are valuable, and they take less space than cattle. They're also easier to maintain. Elias looked at her with surprise. You'd want to do that? Raise chickens? I'm terrible at it now, but I'm learning, and if it helps, then yes. I'd want to. Charlotte was warming to the idea. You said desperation is focus with higher stakes. I'm desperate to not starve this winter. That seems like motivation enough. Over the next few weeks, the cabin transformed from the place of Charlotte's initial horror into something that resembled, carefully and tentatively, a home. The leaks were patched. The walls were sealed with mud and straw, a process that left Charlotte caked in dirt but oddly satisfied. The windows were covered with oiled paper to hold in warmth, turning the cabin into a perpetual twilight that took some getting used to. The work was relentless. Every day brought new lessons, new challenges, new ways to fail. Charlotte's hands became a map of blisters and calluses. Her back and shoulders developed muscles she didn't know existed. She fell asleep sitting up at dinner more than once, her body simply unable to continue. But she learned. She learned to start a fire without kindling, using charcloth and steady hands. She learned to read the sky for weather signs, the particular shade of clouds that meant rain, the way the wind shifted before a storm. She learned which vegetables would keep through winter and which would rot within weeks. She learned that water had to be boiled if you wanted to stay healthy, though Elias didn't seem to understand why. He'd been drinking creek water his whole life without dying, he pointed out, as if his survival meant the danger was theoretical. You'll get sick, she warned him. Probably not. Absolutely, definitely. Boil your water. Yes, ma'am, he said, but he still drank from the creek when he thought she wasn't looking. The chickens became her particular project. She started with the original 8, but began saving eggs to hatch new chicks in the spring, using an old wooden box that Elias helped her insulate. She kept detailed notes on which hens laid the most, which ones ate the most feed, which ones were too mean to keep around. "You're treating this like it's science," Elias observed one afternoon, watching her record information in a notebook. "It is science. Selective breeding, resource management, yield optimization. My father's business manager taught me that before everything fell apart." Charlotte marked down that Bess had laid 3 eggs in a week, unusual, and probably meant she was about to stop laying altogether. "If we can identify the best layers and breed from them, we might increase egg production by 20% within 2 years. 20% would make a real difference. Then we do the work now so that we can reap the benefits later." It was philosophy applied to chickens, but it worked. Everything worked better when Charlotte approached it systematically instead of through trial and error. She started keeping notes on everything: which recipes used the fewest ingredients, which preserved foods lasted longest, how much wood they burned in a cold week versus a warm week. "You're turning survival into accounting," Elias said, but he was smiling. "I'm turning chaos into predictability." In the second week of October, the circuit preacher arrived, a thin, weathered man named Reverend Hutchins who'd traveled the territory for 30 years. He performed the ceremony in the cabin, with Tom and Jack as witnesses and Margaret Chen as the only other guest who could be spared from the store. Charlotte wore the gray work dress, her good gray work dress, which was considerably less gray after she'd managed to get the worst stains out. Elias wore a shirt that wasn't entirely mud-colored, which was the best he could manage on short notice. The ceremony took 15 minutes. Afterward, they had beans with salt pork and the bread Charlotte had learned to make. Real bread now, not the dense bricks of her first attempts. Margaret had brought a pie, which seemed to shock Elias profoundly. "You made pie?" he asked Margaret. "I make pie sometimes. Charlotte's going to teach me how to make better bread, so we're trading skills." Margaret cut generous slices. "This is what women do, Elias. We keep each other alive." Charlotte and Margaret sat by the fire after the meal, while Elias and Tom and Jack went out to check on livestock. They didn't have much in common. Margaret was from San Francisco, had lived out here for nearly 20 years, had no children, and seemed unbothered by that fact. But they had something. An understanding, maybe. The knowledge that they'd both chosen a hard life because the alternative was harder. "How long before you regret this?" Margaret asked, lighting a pipe. "I already regret some things," Charlotte said carefully, "but marrying Elias isn't one of them. He's not a bad man, but he's a drowning man, and drowning men pull their partners under sometimes." "I know." Charlotte thought about the banker's ledger, about the thin margins and the years of debt. "But I'm a drowning woman. Maybe together we can at least keep our heads above water." Margaret smiled. "That's more practical than most people manage." The nights got colder as autumn deepened. Charlotte woke one morning to frost on the inside of the windows, patterns of ice that sparkled in the lantern light. Snow came. Not the gentle snow of Boston, but hard, driving snow that came sideways and left drifts as tall as a man against the windward side of the cabin. They spent 3 days preparing for the deep cold that was coming, checking the seal on the walls, reinforcing the roof, storing wood until the cabin was surrounded by cords of it. Elias hunted and brought back a deer, which Charlotte had to learn to butcher. That was perhaps the hardest lesson yet. Understanding that the animal she'd pitied became the protein that would keep them alive. "You don't have to watch," Elias said, noticing her pale face. "Yes, I do." Charlotte forced herself to stay present as Elias worked. "If I'm going to eat it, I should know what it costs." By December, the cabin was sealed tight as a drum. The root cellar was full, jars of preserved vegetables, squash piled like treasure, potatoes and turnips and carrots buried in sand. The smokehouse held venison and salt pork. The grain barrel was full. They had everything they needed to survive the winter, provided the supply held and nothing unexpected happened. Charlotte had developed calluses on top of her calluses. Her hands, once white and soft, were now brown and capable. Her face was weathered by sun and wind. She could milk the cow without getting kicked. She could start a fire without thinking. She could make bread that was actually edible, and biscuits that didn't taste like punishment. One night in mid-December, After they'd eaten and the dishes were washed and the fire was banked for the night, Elias gave her something. It was wrapped in cloth, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. "Open it." Inside was a book. Not a new book. It was old, the leather cover cracked and worn, but it was real. Charlotte opened it carefully, afraid the pages might fall apart. Poetry. Tennyson, Byron, Emily Dickinson. "Where did you get this?" "Town. Years ago when I still had a little money and thought maybe—" He didn't finish. "I never read it. Seemed like it was wasting time. But you like poetry from your letters. You read it at night sometimes. I hear you through the wall." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. The first tears since that first day in the cabin. Not tears of despair, but something else. Something that felt dangerously like hope. "Thank you," she whispered. That night she sat by the fire and read to him, aloud, the way she'd mentioned in her letters. The way that had made Elias's world feel larger for the first time in years. She read Byron's Don Juan and watched Elias's face in the firelight. Saw him struggling with the language and the concepts, but engaged in a way she'd never seen him before. "Does any of it make sense?" she asked when she finished a section. "Not really. But hearing you say the words, it's nice, like there's more to the world than wheat and debt and cold. There is more. There's art and beauty. And I know there is. I just rarely remember that. Seems like something you have to be reminded of." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for reminding me." December deepened. The cold became genuinely dangerous, the kind of cold where exposed skin froze in minutes. They stopped going outside except to feed the animals and bring in water and wood. The window coverings turned to ice on the inside. Breath froze in the air. Charlotte had never been this cold in her life. Boston winters seemed tropical in comparison. This cold was alive, malevolent, a force that wanted them dead. Every night she lay under the quilts, piling on blankets, and still woke shivering. The roof creaked under the weight of snow. Ice formed on the walls despite the fire burning all day and all night. One night, around Christmas, though there were no decorations, no acknowledgement of the holiday beyond Charlotte insisting they eat something slightly less bland, Charlotte woke to silence, complete, absolute silence. The wind had stopped. She lay in the darkness, listening. Usually, the wind was constant, a howling presence that never ceased. The silence was somehow worse, like the world had stopped and died. She got up and went to the main room where the fire had burned down to coals. Elias was already awake, standing at the window, looking out at the snow-covered darkness. "What is it?" Charlotte asked. "Blizzard coming. You can feel it." "How can you tell?" "The quiet. Everything's waiting. Animals know something's about to happen and they're all hunkered down, not making noise." He turned to her. "We should stay inside when it hits. Don't try to go to the barn for anything. The animals can survive a day or two without extra care. We can't survive being caught in that." "How long will it last?" "Could be 6 hours, could be 3 days. Out here you never know." He pulled on his coat. "I'm going to check the barn, make sure the animals have water and enough hay. Then we batten down completely. Don't open that door until I come back." "Elias, promise me." "I promise." He left, and Charlotte sat by the fire, listening to the world hold its breath. The blizzard came at dawn with a sound like the end of everything. The wind didn't howl, it screamed, a high-pitched shriek that made the cabin walls vibrate. Snow came sideways so thick you couldn't see 10 feet, couldn't see the barn, couldn't see anything but white. The temperature plummeted until Charlotte was genuinely afraid the fire wouldn't keep them warm. For 2 days they stayed inside. They read poetry and burned wood and ate from their stores, watching the snow pile against the windows until the light turned blue-gray and perpetual. The barn disappeared. The world disappeared. There was only the cabin and the 2 people inside it and the storm that wanted to kill them both. On the 3rd day, the silence came again. Elias opened the door to find the snow had drifted 8 feet high against the cabin. It took him an hour of digging to create a path to the barn. The animals were alive, though thin and thirsty. He brought buckets of snow inside for them to melt. Charlotte helped, wading through drifts that came up to her waist, gasping at the cold that burned her lungs. "This is winter," Elias said when they were back inside, warming their hands by the fire. "This is what we're fighting." Charlotte nodded, unable to speak through her chattering teeth. She'd known it intellectually. She knew it in her bones now, this bone-deep understanding that out here, survival was a daily miracle. Every night you woke up, you'd won. Every meal you got to eat, you'd beaten the cold. It was a different way of measuring success. That night, as the wind picked up again, preparing for another round of snow, Charlotte asked Elias a question that had been forming in her mind for weeks. Do you regret it? Getting married? Taking on another person to feed when you can barely feed yourself? He was quiet for a long time. No, I regret ordering a mail-order bride like you were merchandise. I regret lying in my letters. But having you here? No. This winter would have been twice as hard alone. Would have been impossible, probably. I'd have either frozen or starved or worked myself to death trying to do everything. He looked at her. You made it survivable. Maybe even better than that. I'm still learning. I know. But you're learning while being freezing and terrified, which means you're actually brave, whether you know it or not. Charlotte thought about that in the darkness later, as another blizzard raged and the cabin creaked under the assault. Brave wasn't how she'd describe herself. Desperate, maybe. Stubborn, certainly, but brave required a choice, and she'd simply made the only choice available to her, except that wasn't quite true anymore. She could have left when Caldwell mentioned the foreclosure risk. She could have taken Margaret's skepticism seriously and run back east. Instead, she'd stayed because staying had become her choice, not just her circumstance. The wind screamed outside. The fire burned in the hearth. Charlotte pulled the quilts closer and waited for morning, and understood that she was going to survive this winter, not because she had to, but because she'd decided she would. January came with a cruelty that made December seem gentle. The temperatures dropped so far that Elias stopped bothering to record them. 30 below, 40 below. The distinction ceased to matter when the cold could kill you in minutes either way. The snow piled higher, drifting until it buried the fence posts and made the world into an undifferentiated white expanse, broken only by the dark shape of the barn and the smoke rising from the cabin chimney. Charlotte had learned to measure time differently now, not by days, but by survival metrics, by how much wood they burned, how much food they consumed, whether the animals made it through another night, by whether she woke up in the morning, which had become its own small victory. It was the kind of cold that crept into your bones and lived there, the kind that made thinking difficult, made simple tasks complicated. She'd read somewhere that extreme cold affected the mind, made people depressed and slow. Now she believed it. Some mornings she could barely convince herself to get out of bed, despite knowing the fire needed tending and the animals needed feeding and the day needed facing. Elias was worse. He'd started coughing in early January, a dry, hacking cough that came from deep in his chest. At first, Charlotte assumed it would pass, that it was just the dust from the hay or the smoke from the fire, but it persisted, worsening. By mid-January, he was coughing so hard he'd have to stop working, bending double until the fit passed. You need to see a doctor, Charlotte said, watching him struggle through breakfast. There's no doctor within 50 miles, and we can't spare the time anyway. Animals need feeding, firewood needs cutting. The animals will survive without you for one day. You won't survive another week of that cough. I'm fine. You're clearly not fine. Say, you sound like you're coughing up your lungs. I'm fine, he repeated with the stubborn tone of a man who wasn't used to anyone arguing with him. It's just cold in the lungs. Happens every winter. It didn't sound like just cold in the lungs. It sounded like something worse, something that made Charlotte lie awake at night listening to him cough in the other room, trying not to let the fear show on her face in the morning. The problem was she had limited resources. No doctor, no medicine beyond what she'd brought from Boston. Some quinine, some laudanum, basic supplies that seemed increasingly useless. She had her own intelligence and her ability to work, and neither of those seemed particularly useful against a winter cough that wouldn't quit. She started making him tea with honey and herbs from the dried plants she'd prepared in the fall. She increased his portions at dinner, trying to build his strength. She nagged him relentlessly to stay inside, to rest, to let the work slide for a few days. The work doesn't slide, he said. It just gets worse. If I don't cut wood now, we won't have enough to burn next week. If I don't feed the animals, they'll die. If you die, none of it matters. He looked at her with something like pity. You still don't understand how this works. Out here, you don't get to rest because something might happen. You rest when you're done working or when you're dead. Those are the options. Charlotte understood better than he gave her credit for. She understood that out here, death was always waiting. It was patient and cold and inevitable if you gave it an opening. But she also understood that she couldn't survive watching Elias work himself into an early grave. And she couldn't survive alone on this ranch, and if she had to choose between his pride and his pride could go to hell. So she made deals with him. If he stayed inside one day, she'd do the heaviest outside work, which meant she spent a freezing afternoon hauling water from the creek and breaking ice on the animal troughs, her fingers going numb despite the gloves, her legs shaking from effort and cold. If he let her wrap a cloth around his chest to hold the heat close, he could do lighter work. If he drank the terrible herbal tea, she wouldn't mention the cough again that day. They were small compromises that didn't actually fix the problem, but they gave them both the illusion of control. By the end of January, the cough was worse. The food stores were holding, but not generously. They were eating less than they should, stretching supplies thinner because neither of them wanted to admit how much longer winter still had to go. February stretched ahead of them like a threat. It was on a night when the temperature had dropped past the point of bearing, when the thermometer Elias had hung outside read something like 45 below, that the milk cow went into labor. Charlotte was asleep when Elias came into the bedroom, already dressed and putting on his coat. "Where are you going?" "Rosie's birthing. I felt it when I checked on the animals an hour ago." "In this cold?" Charlotte was out of bed immediately, reaching for her clothes. "That's insane! Calves don't care about the temperature. She needs help." "Then I'm coming with you." "You're not coming out in this cold. You'll freeze." "So will you." Charlotte pulled on her work dress over her nightclothes, not bothering with corset or stays, just layers, as much insulation as she could manage. Two people working are faster than one, and if something goes wrong, you'll need someone to go get help. There's nobody to get. We're 15 miles from town and nobody travels in this. Then we both need to be there so both of us know what to do next. They stared at each other for a moment, the frozen-faced standoff between two people who'd both learned that compromise was survival, but neither wanted to compromise on this particular issue. Elias lost, which meant he understood as well as she did that he was sick and weak and might need help. They went out into a cold so profound it felt solid. It had a weight, a presence. It burned your throat to breathe. The snow that crunched under their boots sounded loud enough to wake the dead. They were only 50 yards from the cabin, but it felt like crossing into another world entirely. A white void where the thermometer read impossible numbers and survival was measured in seconds. The barn was warmer, barely. The animal's body heat had at least raised the temperature above deadly. Rosie was in the birthing pen, down on her side, her flanks heaving. When she saw Elias, she made a low sound, not quite a moo, something more primal. "It's coming," Elias said, kneeling beside her. "That's good. That means—" He stopped, his hand going to Rosie's side. His face went still in a way that frightened Charlotte. "It's breached." "What does that mean?" "It means the calf is backward. Legs coming out first or sideways, not head first. If we can't turn it, both mother and calf die." Charlotte's stomach twisted. "What do we do?" "I have to reach in and turn it. But it's going to be hard. She's going to fight, and the calf's stuck." He was already pulling off his coat, rolling up his sleeves. "I need you to hold the lantern. Just stand there and keep the light steady. Can you do that?" Charlotte nodded, not trusting her voice. What followed was the worst hour of her life. Elias worked while Rosie screamed and thrashed. The calf was definitely breached. Charlotte could see the backward legs protruding, slick with fluid. Elias had to reach up inside the cow, working blind, trying to find the calf's body and rotate it so the head came first. Rosie fought him, her muscles contracting, trying to expel what shouldn't be expelled yet. "Easy, girl," Elias was saying, his voice steady despite the sweat running down his face. "Easy, we're going to fix this. Charlotte, keep the light steady." Charlotte's arms ached almost immediately, but she didn't move. The lantern couldn't waver. If it did, Elias worked blind. If he worked blind, Rosie and the calf both died. Minutes crawled by. Time became flexible and strange. Elias was saying something, maybe to Rosie, maybe to himself, maybe to the universe that would allow a man to work so hard and still potentially lose everything. "Come on," he was muttering. "Come on, just turn. Just turn." Charlotte heard her own breathing, harsh and frightened. The lantern shook despite her efforts to hold it steady. She was freezing, even in the relatively warmer barn, and more terrified than she'd ever been. And then Elias made a sound, not quite a shout, not quite a laugh. "I've got it. I've got the head. Now—" Another contraction, violent this time. Rosie screamed. The calf came suddenly, a wet mass that hit the barn floor and lay still. "Lantern, I need more light," Elias said, not looking up. Charlotte moved closer, her arms trembling so hard she could barely hold the lantern steady. Elias was doing something with the calf's mouth, clearing fluid from its nose. For a long moment, nothing happened. The calf was limp, dead-looking. Then it gasped. It was a small sound, barely audible, but it was the most beautiful sound Charlotte had ever heard. The calf gasped and then started breathing, shallow at first and then deeper, its sides expanding and contracting as it learned how to exist in the world. Rosie lifted her head, making a low, urgent sound. She started cleaning the calf, licking it frantically, and the calf struggled to its feet with that drunk, uncoordinated look of newborns everywhere. "He's alive," Charlotte heard herself say. "They're both alive." "Yeah." Elias was sitting back on his heels, breathing hard. Blood covered his arms up to the elbow. Sweat dripped from his face despite the cold. "Yeah, they're alive." He started coughing then, deep, racking coughs that bent him double. Charlotte dropped the lantern on a hay bale and went to him, supporting his weight as he fought for breath. She could feel how thin he'd become, how the illness had hollowed him out. The cough was worse in the cold, worse when he'd been working hard, worse when he was exhausted. "We need to get you inside," she said. "In a minute. Need to check—" He was on his feet, moving to Rosie despite the coughing. Charlotte wanted to strangle him. He checked the cow with hands that trembled, made sure the afterbirth was coming, made sure both mother and calf were stable. Only then did he allow Charlotte to lead him back to the cabin. She got him inside and directly to the fire, stripping off his coat and shirt while he was too exhausted to argue. The temperature drop was visible on his skin, gooseflesh rising, shivers starting. She wrapped him in blankets while he coughed and tried to assure her that he was fine. He just needed to warm up. "You're not fine," Charlotte said, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "You're sick and you're exhausted, and you just worked like a madman in 45 below weather. You're about as far from fine as a person can be." "The calf would have died." "So would you." "The calf is valuable. I'm not." "Don't you dare!" Charlotte's voice came out harsh. "Don't you dare say that to me. Don't you dare suggest that you're less valuable than an animal. I didn't survive the last 4 months for you to work yourself to death in a barn." Elias looked at her with something like surprise in his eyes. His lips were blue, and his teeth were chattering despite being wrapped in blankets. And he looked more vulnerable than Charlotte had ever seen him. But he didn't argue. She made him drink hot water with honey and herbs. She sat beside him while he coughed and shivered and gradually, slowly began to warm. She didn't leave, didn't go to bed, just sat in the chair beside the fire and watched him like she could keep him alive through sheer force of will. Toward morning, his fever broke. She realized it when his skin went from cold and clammy to hot and dry. She got more water in him, changed the blankets, and finally allowed herself to believe he might not die. "I'm sorry," he said hoarsely, sometime near dawn. His voice was barely a whisper. "For scaring you." "I'm not scared. I'm furious." Charlotte was surprised to find she was crying. "You can't keep doing this. You can't keep working yourself sick and then pretending it's nothing. I can't—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Can't what?" "Can't lose you. I'm here because I chose to be here. Because somewhere in the last 4 months, this became my home. And you became—" She couldn't finish that either. "I know," he said quietly. "I know. I'll be more careful." He wasn't. Not really. Over the next week, as the fever broke and the immediate crisis passed, Elias went back to working, going back to ignoring the cough and the weakness and the exhaustion. Charlotte watched him do it and felt something sharp and cutting grow in her chest, a mixture of love and rage and the knowledge that she couldn't force him to take care of himself. She could only take care of herself. And she had. One morning, near the end of February, she realized something had shifted. She wasn't surviving anymore. She was living. It happened without announcement, without moment. One day she'd been counting the cost of every action. The next day she was thinking about next spring, about expanding the chicken operation, about replanting the garden in bigger sections. about the future. She'd stopped measuring her life against her past. The Boston version of Charlotte Whitmore, the one with the servants and the tea parties and the elaborate evening gowns, didn't exist anymore. That person had been burned away by frontier cold and necessity and the simple act of choosing to stay. The woman sitting at the rough table in the cabin, planning chicken breeds and garden layouts and ways to improve the ranch's finances, was someone different, someone who'd learned that her own hands could keep her alive, that her mind could solve problems that didn't have easy answers, that she was stronger than she'd ever believed. She was making bread when Elias came in from checking the animals, his cough finally, starting to ease. "Bread smells good," he said, and it was such a simple statement that Charlotte almost missed the weight of it. A man who'd eaten burned beans and ruined biscuits saying her bread smelled good like it was the most natural thing in the world. She pulled the loaves from the oven and turned to look at him. He was thinner than he should be, and the cough had left marks on his face. But his eyes were clear, and he was smiling. "I've been thinking," Charlotte said, "about what we talked about before the weather got too bad, about the chickens, about diversifying." "Yeah? I want to expand, buy more chicks in spring, start breeding for egg production specifically. And we should talk about sheep. They're hardier than cattle, and wool could be another income source." She was speaking faster now, the ideas pouring out. "And I want to expand the garden. This year I wasted space on things we didn't need. Next year, every plant feeds us or makes money." Elias listened while she talked, not interrupting, just watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she finally asked, self-conscious. "Nothing. Just, you've changed since you got here." "I know, I'm less useless now." "That's not what I mean." He sat down at the table. "When you first arrived, you looked like you were made of something breakable, like the world had already used you up and you didn't have anything left. But somewhere in the last few months, you started looking like you were made of something stronger." Charlotte thought about the calloused hands, the burned face, the permanent curve of her spine from bending over work. She thought about surviving blizzards and colds that killed, about learning to read the sky and the animals and the seasons, about choosing, every single day, to stay. "We both did," she said quietly. "Changed, I mean." "Yeah, we did." He looked at the bread cooling on the table. "I kept thinking, when I first ordered that bride, that I was solving the problem of being alone, that I just needed someone to do the work and be present. But that's not what happened." "What did happen?" "You made this place matter. You made the work matter. Before you came, I was just going through the motions, trying to pay off debt I'd probably never be able to pay off, waiting for something to change, or for me to die trying." He looked at her directly. "Now I'm actually building something. With you." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes again. But these weren't frightened tears. These were different. Outside, February was dying. The cold would linger, the snow would persist, but the worst of winter was passing. In a few weeks, spring would start. Green things would begin to grow, the animals would birth new life, the world would wake up. Charlotte thought about the future she was building here, in a cabin that had terrified her 6 months ago. She thought about the choices that had led her here, and the choices she'd made since. She thought about the mail-order bride she'd been pretending to be, and the woman she'd actually become. Neither of them was who they'd expected. Neither of them was perfect. But standing in the cabin with the bread cooling on the table, and Elias watching her like she was the most valuable thing he owned, Charlotte Whitmore understood that sometimes the greatest things in life came not from planning, but from showing up and refusing to give up when everything suggested you should. The wind rattled the windows, testing the seals they'd worked so hard to make watertight. The fire burned warm in the hearth. And in a cabin in the middle of Montana, two people who'd lied their way into a marriage held something real. Not because of the lies, but in spite of them. Because they'd chosen, again and again, to stop lying and start living. February arrived without mercy. The cold that had seemed unbearable in January somehow found new ways to worsen. The thermometer outside the cabin, a simple glass tube Elias had nailed to the doorframe, stopped registering accurate readings because the alcohol inside it moved too sluggishly in temperatures that weren't supposed to be survivable. Charlotte had read about Arctic expeditions in school, about explorers dying in the snow with journals still in their hands. She'd found those stories romantic once. Now she understood they were just ordinary catastrophe in extraordinary cold. Rosie's calf, the one who'd survived that brutal breech birth in January, had grown into something sturdy and obstinate that Charlotte had privately named Walter, though she hadn't told Elias because he'd laughed at her for naming the chickens, and she wasn't ready for that particular fight. Walter was already eating solid food and nudging Charlotte's hand whenever she came into the barn, and she'd developed a fondness for him that she recognized as dangerously impractical and didn't intend to stop anyway. Elias's cough had settled into something chronic. Not worsening dramatically, not killing him, just present. A passenger that rode with him through every day, announcing itself after hard work, after cold air, after a deep breath. Charlotte had stopped telling him to see a doctor because there was no doctor to see, and because Elias had the maddening ability to simply absorb her worry and continue doing exactly what he intended to do, regardless of it. What she hadn't stopped was watching him. Not obviously, she'd learned that made him irritable, but in the way she calibrated dinner portions to give him more without making a production of it, the way she made sure the fire was built up before he came in from outside so the warmth hit immediately, the way she listened, in the night, to distinguish between a cough that was just a cough and a cough that meant something was getting worse. It was exhausting, caring about someone who refused to be cared for. "You're doing it again," Elias said one morning, not looking up from his coffee. "Doing what?" "Watching me like I'm about to fall over." Charlotte looked down at her own cup. "I don't know what you're talking about. You've got this look, like a mother cat with a sick kitten." That is genuinely the most insulting comparison anyone has ever made to my face. It's accurate, though. He finally looked up. His eyes were clearer this morning than they'd been in weeks. The fever that had come and gone since the barn night mostly gone now. "I'm better, Charlotte. The worst is past." "The worst of this particular illness," she said carefully. "The rest of winter is still out there." "The rest of winter is always out there." He stood, pulling on his coat. "That's the nature of winter. You get through it, then it ends, then it comes back. You can't spend your whole life afraid of the next time." She watched him go out into the gray morning and thought that was easy to say for a man who'd grown up in this. Not so easy when you'd arrived in September with a lace parasol and 14 dresses and no understanding whatsoever of what cold could do to a human body. The days settled into the particular rhythm of deep winter, the monotony that Charlotte had initially found maddening and now found almost comforting in its predictability. Wake before light. Fire first, always. Animals fed and watered before any thought of breakfast. The endless small repairs that cold created, checking wall seals, reinforcing the barn door that swung loose when the wind came from the north, breaking ice on the water trough before it got thick enough to trap an animal trying to drink. Charlotte had taken over the account books entirely. Not because Elias couldn't manage them, but because she was faster and more systematic, and one afternoon she'd sat down with 3 months of records and found 2 systematic errors in his calculations that had caused him to underpay himself on the feed ratios. "You've been feeding them too much," she told him, spreading the ledger across the table after dinner. "Animals need feed to survive. They need the right amount of feed. You've been calculating by volume instead of by weight. And because the grain settled different this year, denser, probably because of the way it was stored, you've been overfeeding by about 15%. She pointed to her calculations. "That's 15% of our feed reserves that we've burned through unnecessarily since October." Elias stared at the numbers. "That's significant." "Yes, we still have enough to finish the winter, but barely. If spring comes late, we'll need to buy supplemental feed in town, which costs money we don't have." She tapped the column. "Going forward, we calculate by weight. I made a measuring system from one of the kitchen scales." He looked at her with an expression she'd learned to read over months. Not quite impressed, not quite surprised. Somewhere between the two with a quality she didn't have a word for, like he was revising something in his mind. "How did you figure that out?" he asked. "I noticed the grain sacks felt heavier than usual when we moved them into the barn, and I started thinking about why, and then I recalculated what I thought we should have used against what we actually had left, and the numbers didn't match, so I went back through the records." She shrugged. "Accounting isn't complicated, it's just attention. I've been doing this for 3 years. You've been doing it alone for 3 years. A second set of eyes changes things." She closed the ledger. "This isn't a criticism. You kept this ranch alive without help. That's not nothing. But it's not enough. Not always, but neither is what I can do alone. That's the point." She started clearing the dinner plates. "Together we catch the things we miss separately. He helped her clear, which had become habit without either of them quite deciding it would be. Simple things like that had accumulated across the months. Small shared tasks, shared silences, the particular shorthand that developed between people who spent every waking hour in close proximity with high stakes. Charlotte had stopped being careful around him. She'd been careful in the beginning, modulating her reactions, controlling her expressions, performing a version of herself she thought a frontier wife should be. At some point, she couldn't identify exactly when, she'd run out of energy for the performance and started just being herself, and discovered that the real version was better suited for this life anyway. The real Charlotte said exactly what she thought, argued back when Elias was being unreasonable, made decisions without waiting for permission, told Jack Brennan when his fence repair was inadequate and would need to be redone before spring, a conversation that had left the young man red-faced and Charlotte entirely unrepentant. "He's going to talk about me in town," Elias warned her afterward. "Let him. The fence would have fallen before April and we'd have lost animals through the gap. I'd rather be talked about than lose livestock." "You're not wrong. Just, Jack's sensitive. Jack is 20 years old and learning his trade. Better he gets corrected now than continues doing it wrong." Charlotte paused. "Was I too harsh?" "Probably, but you weren't wrong. I'll buy him a coffee next time we're in town. That's the best I can do." She bought Jack coffee, and he was awkward about it for exactly 1 cup before he started talking about a cow he'd been treating for a hoof ailment and asked Charlotte's opinion on feed modifications that might help the animal's recovery. She spent 40 minutes discussing bovine nutrition with a 20-year-old Montana cowhand and thought absurdly that this was the most useful conversation she'd had in years. The blizzard came again in mid-February. Not as savage as the one in December, but persistent, dragging on for 4 days instead of 2. They were inside together for long enough that the specific geography of each other's irritating habits became impossible to ignore. Elias ate loudly. He had no particular awareness of this and seemed genuinely surprised when Charlotte mentioned it, then immediately became hyper-aware and silent, at meals, in a way that was somehow more annoying than the noise had been. Charlotte talked to herself when she was working through a problem, a running murmur of numbers and observations that Elias initially thought was addressed to him and answered twice before realizing it wasn't. "Are you talking to me or to the air?" he asked one afternoon. "To myself, I think better out loud." "Warn a man." I answered 2 questions I wasn't being asked and got very confused. "What did you answer?" I said yes, and then I said I thought it would last until Thursday. "You were right about Thursday. What did you say yes to?" "I have no idea." Charlotte started warning him when she was thinking aloud, and he started chewing with slightly more restraint, and neither of them mentioned any of it again because some accommodations are just made without the ceremony of acknowledgement. The day the blizzard broke, Charlotte went outside to find the sky a clean, washed blue that seemed impossible after the gray assault of the storm. The snow was thick and still, the air cold enough to make her eyes water. She stood outside the cabin door and just breathed for a minute, real breath, deep, in open air, and felt something unclench in her chest that she hadn't realized was clenched. "Clear for at least 2 days, Elias said from behind her, reading the sky with the automatic ease of a man who'd been doing it for years. "Temperature's still down, but no new weather coming. Good day to check the fences and see what the storm did." The north fence was already weak before the storm. "I know. If the drifts took it down, we'll have a problem." He looked at her standing in the doorway in her work dress and canvas coat. "You don't have to come out for fence work." "I know." Charlotte stepped off the porch. "I'm coming anyway." They spent the morning trudging through thigh-high drifts, checking the fence line that bordered the north pasture. The north fence was down in 2 places. Wooden posts snapped at the base where ice had expanded in the grain and split the wood. If anything had been grazing in that pasture, they'd have had animals in the neighbor's territory before anyone noticed. Nothing was grazing in February. That was the one mercy. "We need iron posts," Charlotte said, looking at the broken wood. "More expensive, but they'd hold." "More expensive is the problem." "Can we reuse the wood from the downed sections to replace other posts that are still standing but cracked? That way we only need to buy for the sections that are entirely gone, and budget the iron for the sections with the highest exposure." Elias looked at the fence, then back at her. "You've been looking at this fence." "I look at everything. It's what I do." Charlotte pointed to a section 30 yards down. "That post is cracked at the base. You can see it from here. It'll go next big storm. But if we pull it now and use it to replace one of the truly broken ones, it still has some useful life before it fails entirely. That's actually a good plan. I've been thinking about the ranch in sections. What fails first versus what fails eventually versus what's sound. That way, when we have money for improvements, we spend it where it prevents the next crisis, not where the last one already happened. They repaired what they could with salvaged wood, marked the sections that needed iron posts in Charlotte's notebook under the heading Future Purchases, and made it back to the cabin before the afternoon cold became genuinely dangerous. Charlotte made soup for dinner. Real soup, not beans, because she'd been saving a ham hock for a week waiting for the right moment and decided the end of a blizzard qualified. Elias ate 2 bowls without speaking and then said it was the best thing he'd tasted since the previous October, which in its own restrained way was the highest praise she'd received since arriving. "I've been writing to my brother," Charlotte said, clearing the dishes. Elias looked up. "When?" "The last few weeks. There's been enough quiet time." She kept her voice neutral, not sure how he'd take it. "I told him about the ranch, about the winter, about the improvements we're planning." "You told your brother you married a struggling rancher with a leaking cabin and 40 acres of debt." "I told him I married a man who's building something real in a landscape that would have killed most people, and that I'm helping build it." She set the dishes in the wash basin. "He didn't know I was even considering Montana. When I left Boston, I told him I was going to visit a friend in Philadelphia. I thought if it went wrong, I could just never tell him the truth. And now? And now it hasn't gone wrong." Charlotte turned to face him. "So he should know where I am, who I am now." Elias was quiet, studying the fire. "Does he know you were desperate? That you had no money, nowhere to go?" "Yes, I told him that too." She sat back down across from him. "I'm tired of managing what people think of me. I did that my whole life in Boston, and it was exhausting and completely pointless. My brother should know his sister's situation, the real one, not the version I construct to seem less pathetic." "You're not pathetic. I know that now. I didn't when I left, but I told him about it anyway because the truth is better than the lie, even when the lie is easier." She paused. "He wrote back." "What did he say?" Charlotte reached into her dress pocket and produced a much-folded letter. She'd been carrying it around for days, not sure why, not sure how to bring it up. "He said he was sorry, that he and his wife should have done more when everything fell apart. He said he was glad I was safe." She set the letter on the table. "He also sent $5, which he probably couldn't really afford, so I'm going to send it back." Elias looked at the letter. He'd had no family since his father died. Nobody to write to, nobody to hear from. Charlotte had understood early on that this was a wound he kept covered, and she'd never pushed at it. But she could see something in his face now, watching her hold this letter from a brother who'd failed her and still tried to reach back. "Don't send it back," he said finally. "It's his money. Let him send the $5. It'll make him feel less terrible. That's worth something." He stood, moving toward the fire. "Family's complicated. Even when they fail you, they're still family. Let him have the small gesture." Charlotte folded the letter carefully and put it back in her pocket. "When did you get wise about family?" "I've had years alone to think about it." He poked at the coals. "The thing about being alone is you spend a lot of time going over the past. What you'd do different, what you wish you'd said." He replaced the poker. "Eventually you either learn something from all that, or you go crazy. I got lucky. I mostly learned." The night came down hard and cold, but clear. The stars sharp and brilliant in the black sky. The kind of stars you never saw in cities. Charlotte had started looking at them in November, learning the constellations from a book she'd found in the bottom of one of her trunks that had belonged to her father. She'd told Elias about it, and he'd admitted he knew most of the constellations already, not from a book, just from years of reading the sky for weather and navigation. "Who taught you?" she'd asked. "Nobody, just watching and figuring out patterns." That was Elias in miniature, Charlotte had thought. Self-taught in everything, stubborn and observational, carrying knowledge in his body that he'd earned through paying attention. The month ground on toward its ending. The cold stayed severe but no longer felt apocalyptic. Charlotte had adjusted, had developed the animal-level calibration to cold that let you distinguish between dangerous and uncomfortable. She no longer panicked when the thermometer dropped. She assessed and responded and kept moving. One afternoon near the end of February, she was in the barn doing the afternoon feeding when she heard a sound that stopped her cold. It was coming from the far corner, behind the hay bales, a low, rhythmic sound she couldn't immediately identify. She set down the feed bucket and moved carefully around the bales. In the corner, nested in a hollow, scraped in the loose hay, were 3 cats she'd never seen before. Or rather, one adult barn cat she'd seen occasionally since arriving but never gotten close to, and 2 newborn kittens, blind and helpless, curled against their mother. The cat looked up at Charlotte with the particular expression of new mothers everywhere, equal parts exhausted and fiercely protective. Charlotte looked at the kittens, then at the cat. "When did you even get here?" she said out loud. The cat blinked slowly. Not her problem. Charlotte went back to the feed bucket, finished the barn chores, and when she came back to the cabin, told Elias there were barn cats in the far corner with new kittens. He raised his eyebrows. "Since when do we have barn cats?" "Since apparently always. I've seen one occasionally, but never put together that she was living in the barn." Charlotte hung up her coat. "She's got 2 kittens. They look healthy." "Good. Barn cats keep the rodents down." He considered. "Don't name them." "Too late. Her name is Josephine." "You named 3 chickens, a calf, and now a cat. Naming things makes it easier to track which one is which." "The kittens don't have names?" "Not yet. I'm still getting to know them." Charlotte moved to the stove to start dinner. "Naming requires acquaintance. I'm not the kind of person who names things before they've shown you their personality." "Walter the calf has a personality?" "He's greedy and stubborn and shoves the others out of the way to get fed first." Charlotte started cutting potatoes. "Of course I named him Walter." She heard Elias laugh. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere genuine and unguarded. He hadn't laughed much before winter. He laughed more now. She'd noticed it around Christmas and hadn't said anything because pointing at happiness sometimes scared it away. But it was there. In the cabin with the dirt floor and the leaking roof and the iron stove that needed perpetual coaxing, in the ranch with its thin financial margins and aging fence posts and barn cats nobody knew they had, there was actual warmth, not just from the fire. It had grown slowly, the way things grew in cold climates. Not like the gardens of Boston, sudden and dramatic in the spring. More like the Montana grass that came up through snow in patches, a little at a time, persisting against conditions designed to stop it. The evening settled. Charlotte read from the Tennyson after dinner while Elias worked on mending a harness strap by lamplight, his hands moving automatically while he listened. Outside, the temperature dropped, and the stars burned and the barn held its small livestock population, including 3 cats and 1 calf named Walter, and the last of a winter that had tried very hard to break 2 people who turned out to be somewhat harder to break than expected. Charlotte read a poem about loss and time and the stubborn persistence of things that mattered. Elias said nothing when she finished it, just kept working the leather. But she could tell from the quality of his silence that he'd been listening to every word. "That's a sad one," he finally said. "Most of the best ones are." She turned the page. "Do you want me to find a less sad one?" "No." He pulled the stitching tight. "Sad doesn't mean bad. Sad just means it's about something real." Charlotte looked at him over the top of the book. The lamplight made everything amber and warm. Outside, Montana was doing its level best to kill them all, patient and cold and indifferent. Inside, against all reasonable expectation, something was alive. She turned to the next poem and kept reading. Spring came to Montana the way everything came to Montana, on its own terms, indifferent to what you needed or expected. It didn't arrive in a single day of warmth and green. It arrived in arguments. A week of thaw followed by a hard freeze that killed the first shoots of grass and coated the mud in a deceptive layer of ice. Then 3 days of rain so cold it was almost sleet, turning the yard into a lake of brown water that swallowed boot tops. Then sun, real sun, the kind with actual heat in it, for exactly 2 days before another storm rolled in from the northwest and dumped 6 inches of wet, heavy snow that broke 2 fence posts that had survived the entire winter. Elias looked at those broken posts and didn't say anything for a long moment. "I hate April," he finally said. "It's March," Charlotte said. "I hate March, too." She'd learned not to offer optimism in these moments. Optimism was what people offered when they weren't the ones looking at broken fence posts and calculating what they'd cost to replace against a budget that didn't have the room for them. What Elias needed wasn't reassurance. He needed the fence post dealt with. So she went to the barn and got the tools, and they fixed the fence in the wet snow without talking about it. That was marriage, Charlotte had decided. Not the ceremony, not the vows, the fence posts in the wet snow. The ranch came alive with the spring in ways that managed to be both beautiful and relentlessly demanding. The livestock that had survived winter were thin and needed building back up. The garden needed clearing and turning and planting, and the window for planting was narrow. Too early, and the frost killed everything. Too late, and you didn't get a full harvest before the next winter came. The chickens, Charlotte's chickens, now numbering 23 after the spring hatching, needed a proper expanded coop because the original 8-hen structure was a fire hazard and a disease risk with that many birds crammed together. Charlotte had been planning the expanded coop since January, when she'd had nothing but time and lamplight and cold. She'd drawn it in her notebook, not architectural drawings, she had no training for that, but functional sketches. Dimensions, materials needed, ventilation requirements based on what she'd read about poultry disease prevention. She'd calculated the lumber against what they had stored in the barn and what they'd need to buy. "This is more sophisticated than my actual cabin," Elias said, looking at her plans one evening. "Your cabin is adequate. My chickens need specific conditions to maximize production." Charlotte pointed to the ventilation design. Cross-ventilation here and here without creating drafts. Disease moves through chickens faster than through people. If I lose the flock to something preventable, we lose an income source we're depending on. We're depending on eggs now? We will be. By fall, I'm expecting consistent egg production from 18 of the 23 birds. We keep the household supply and sell the surplus to Margaret for the boarding house. She pays 15 cents a dozen. Over the winter period alone, that's potentially $12 to $15. She tapped the page. That doesn't sound like much, but it's $12 we don't currently have. Elias built the coop over 4 days in April, with Charlotte doing everything she was physically capable of doing alongside him. He didn't ask her to help and didn't tell her to stop. By now, they'd both learned that she participated in every project on the ranch, whether it was physical work she could contribute to or the planning stage or just standing nearby and handing tools on request. She'd become part of how things got done, woven into the process so thoroughly that trying to separate her out would have been like trying to separate the warp from the weft in cloth. The day they moved the chickens into the new coop, Bess, the mean rust-colored hen who had been Charlotte's nemesis since September, attacked Jack Brennan, who'd come to help, with such sudden violence that Jack dropped his hat and backed into the fence post hard enough to rattle the wire. "That bird is demonic," Jack said, rubbing his shoulder. "She's territorial," Charlotte said, scooping Bess up with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned exactly how to handle her. "She doesn't like strangers near the flock. She doesn't like anything near anything. She's a very good layer and an excellent protector of the younger hens. She stays." Charlotte deposited Bess in the new coop, where the hen immediately began inspecting the corners with an air of critical authority. "We've come to an understanding." "What kind of understanding?" "I respect her space. She produces eggs and doesn't bite me." Charlotte latched the coop door. "It's more than I can say for most of the relationships in my life." Jack laughed. He'd loosened up considerably since the fence incident the previous fall and Charlotte's coffee peace offering. He came around once a week now, sometimes more, to help with work that needed more hands than two. He had a young man's awkward sincerity that Charlotte had initially found trying and now found quietly touching. He was learning, same as she was. Everything out here was learning. Tom Wu came less frequently, but with more impact. He had 30 years of Montana behind him, had come west as a teenager, worked the railroads, saved enough to buy a small claim, and work it into something sustainable. He was 54 and quiet in a way that felt weighted with things he'd chosen not to say. When he did say something, Charlotte had learned to listen carefully because he didn't waste words. One afternoon in May, Tom came to help Elias build a proper storage shed. The lean-to kitchen addition had never been adequate, and Charlotte was working nearby in the garden when she heard Tom say something that made her stop. "Weather's going to turn by August." Elias didn't look up from his hammer. "How do you know?" "Same pattern as 78. Spring's too wet and the mountain snowpack's too heavy. When that melts fast in July, it'll flood the low pastures. You'll want to move any livestock you're keeping there before the 4th. The south pasture is my best summer grazing. The south pasture is going to be under 2 feet of water for 3 weeks. Then it'll be mud for another month after that. Tom drove a nail with 2 efficient strokes. Pull the animals out by early July. Trust me or don't. Elias pulled the animals out by early July. Charlotte had watched that exchange and filed it away. The way Tom spoke. The way Elias listened. The particular quality of knowledge that came from decades of paying attention to one specific piece of ground in one specific climate. She couldn't have that knowledge herself. Not yet. But she could cultivate the relationships that carried it. She started talking to Tom more deliberately. Not pumping him for information, just talking, asking about his claim, about what he'd learned, about the things he wished someone had told him 30 years ago. He was initially reserved, surprised that she was genuinely interested rather than performing interest to be polite. But over a few months, he opened up, and what came out was worth more than any book on frontier agriculture she'd brought from Boston. "You want to know the real secret to surviving out here?" Tom said one afternoon when they were both waiting for Elias to come back from checking the cattle. He was sitting on the fence rail, looking at the mountains. "Yes," Charlotte said. "Figure out what you can't control and stop spending energy on it. The weather, the prices, the bank. You can prepare for those things, but you can't control them." He squinted at the snow line on the peaks. "What you can control is how you respond, fast or slow, smart or stupid, together or alone." He glanced at her. "You two do better together. That's not nothing. A lot of people pick the wrong partner and spend their whole life fighting the wrong enemy." Charlotte thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. The summer of 1886 was exactly what Tom had predicted. Wet, then flood, then mud. The south pasture disappeared under standing water for most of July, exactly as he'd said. Elias had moved the cattle in time, but 3 of the neighbors who hadn't listened to similar warnings, whether from Tom or from the sky itself, lost fencing, lost some livestock, and lost valuable summer grazing weeks they couldn't get back. Charlotte spent that summer in perpetual motion. The garden was her primary project, bigger than last year, laid out in the systematic way she'd planned through the long winter months. She'd corresponded with Margaret and with a seed merchant in Denver, and had gotten her hands on varieties bred specifically for short-season growing, plants that could mature in the narrow window between the last frost and the first. She grew things they'd eat and things they'd sell, and things she was experimenting with, trying to find what the specific soil and climate of their 40 acres would support. She also started writing, not letters. Well, letters too, including regular correspondence with her brother that had thawed into something approaching warmth over the year, but articles. Short pieces about practical homesteading that she sent to a woman's agricultural journal out of Chicago. She hadn't told Elias she was doing it, partly because she wasn't sure anything would come of it, and she didn't want to explain a failure, and partly because it felt like something that was just hers for a while. The journal published the first piece in August, a practical guide to cold climate food preservation, written from her own experience, without flourish or pretension. Just what worked, what didn't, and why. They sent her $3. She stared at the check for a long time. $3 wasn't much, but it was hers, earned by knowledge she'd built from nothing in a place that had tried to kill her. She told Elias that night, showing him the check and the published piece. He read it slowly. She'd watched him read over the months, understanding that he was a careful reader who moved through text at his own pace and got more out of it than fast readers assumed. And when he finished, he looked up. "This is good," he said. "This is actually good. They want more." The editor wrote back asking if I had additional material on winter livestock management. "Do you?" "I have notes on everything. I just need to write it up properly." Charlotte took the article back, folded it carefully. "It's not much money. It's money that didn't exist yesterday, and it's your name in print." He handed back the check. "You should keep writing." "I plan to." That fall brought the Harvest Festival in Cutter's Ridge, the one Elias had mentioned on her first day. The annual gathering of every ranching family in the valley. Charlotte had heard about it all year in the abstract. Now it arrived as an actual event, wagons pulling up to the town's main street, fiddle music, a potluck supper that stretched 2 tables the length of the building. She wore the good gray dress, her best one now, not because it was fancy, but because she'd repaired it 3 times and knew its every stitch. The women she met were nothing like what she'd imagined when she'd first thought about frontier society. They were hardened, competent, and blunt in a way that initially startled her and then made complete sense. These were women who'd built homes in hostile country, who'd buried children in hard ground, who'd made decisions that kept families alive. They didn't have energy for social games. "You're Elias Boone's wife," a woman said, not unkindly, just stating a fact. She was broad-shouldered and had hands like a man's. "I'm Ruth Halverson. My husband's claim is north of yours about 12 miles. Charlotte, I've heard of your place. You run sheep, don't you?" "Merino, mostly." Ruth looked at her with the assessing look Charlotte had grown accustomed to. "Elias said you'd want to talk about a wool cooperative." "He said that?" "Came by the ranch in September, said his wife had ideas about collective marketing of livestock products to get better prices than individuals could negotiate alone." Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Is that true, or was he making things up?" Charlotte filed away that Elias had been talking about her ideas to neighbors without telling her. She'd address that separately. "It's true. I've been reading about cooperative marketing structures used by dairy farmers in Vermont and Wisconsin. The principle should translate to wool and eggs and potentially other products. If we aggregate supply, we negotiate from a stronger position than any individual ranch can." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled, a slow smile that rearranged her whole face. "Come meet some people?" Over the next 2 hours, Charlotte was introduced to 11 women from ranches across the valley. She talked about cooperative marketing, about collective purchasing of supplies to reduce costs, about shared information on weather and livestock health and market prices. She'd prepared none of this for a formal presentation. She was just talking about things she'd been thinking about, the same way she talked to Elias across the dinner table. But these women listened the way people listened when someone was saying something useful, with full attention, with questions. By the time the fiddle started playing for dancing, Charlotte had 6 tentative commitments to a meeting in October to discuss a formal cooperative structure. She found Elias talking with Tom near the back of the building and told him what had happened in a low, rapid voice. "I know," he said. "You knew this would happen? I knew you'd talk to them, and they'd listen. You talk well. People don't always notice it because you're not performing. You're just actually saying useful things in a useful order." He looked at her steadily. "I've been watching you do it all year, figured it was time you had an audience bigger than me and Jack and Tom." Charlotte felt something complex move through her chest, gratitude and irritation in equal measure. "You could have told me you'd spoken to Ruth Halverson." "I could have, but then you would have been preparing a presentation instead of just talking. You're better when you're just talking." He was unrepentant, clearly. "Was I wrong?" She thought about the 6 commitments, the attentive faces, Ruth Halverson's slow smile. "No," she admitted, "but you're still going to tell me these things in advance going forward." "I'll think about it." Elias. "Yes," he said, "I'll tell you in advance." They danced once, a simple reel that Charlotte only half knew the steps to, and Elias knew even less, which resulted in them both making up steps and stepping on each other's feet, and laughing about it in a way that felt like permission for something, like they'd been given approval to just be people, not just survivors. On the ride home, the stars were out, the enormous Montana stars that she'd come to love, that made the Boston sky look like a scrap of something compared to the real thing. Charlotte sat beside Elias on the wagon seat, closer than strictly necessary, and thought about the year that had passed. October again. She'd been here a year. 12 months ago, she'd stood on a train platform in a silk dress with a ruined parasol, looking at this man and thinking she'd made a catastrophic mistake. She'd been right, partially. The silk dress was ruined. The parasol was in pieces. The mistake she'd imagined. That was wrong. That part hadn't happened. "I've been thinking about the cabin," Elias said. "What about it?" "It's too small. We've made it work, but if—" He stopped. "I want to add a room, maybe 2. I've got timber, and Jack and Tom would help. It's not urgent, but I want to plan for it." Charlotte looked at him in the dark. "Why now?" He was quiet for a moment, the way he got quiet when he was finding words that didn't come naturally. "I've been talking to the bank, not Caldwell. His manager, Reeves. He's more reasonable. Based on this year's numbers, our debt rating improved. We paid more than the minimum because of the egg income and the article money and the good prices we got on the cattle. If next year's similar, Reeves thinks we could refinance at a lower rate. That's good news. Yeah, so I've been thinking, maybe it's time to stop just surviving and start actually building. He kept his eyes on the road ahead. Building requires space, room for things to grow. Charlotte understood what he wasn't quite saying. She'd understood it for a while, actually. The way the future had started to look longer to her. Less like a series of crises to navigate, and more like an actual life being constructed. 2 rooms, she said. 1 for storage that can be converted later. Better foundation. The cabin floor needs to be raised off the ground, or it'll rot in another 10 years. You've been thinking about this. I think about everything. You know this. She paused. There's also the matter of the library. The library. The shelf is full. I have books on the floor now. She'd accumulated them through correspondence and through Margaret and through a box her brother had sent from Boston at Christmas. Her father's books, salvaged from the house sale. I need more shelf space, and I refuse to get rid of books to make room. You've built a library in a 4-room cabin on the Montana frontier. I've built the beginning of a library. I intend to continue. Charlotte folded her hands in her lap. The children will need it. Silence. The wagon rolled on. An owl called somewhere in the darkness. Children, Elias said finally. Eventually, when we're more stable. She kept her voice matter-of-fact, the way she'd learned to discuss difficult things with him. No ceremony, no drama. Just here is a fact we should address. I'm 31. I don't have unlimited time, and the ranch needs more hands eventually anyway. I'd prefer the hands be family. She glanced at him. Unless you disagree. I don't disagree. He looked at her then, took his eyes off the road to look at her directly in a way he didn't do often. I just wasn't sure you wanted that. You never mentioned it. There are a lot of things I haven't mentioned. We've been busy not dying. Charlotte looked back at the stars. Now that we're slightly less busy dying, I'm mentioning it. Elias turned back to the road. His jaw was set in a particular way she'd learned to read. Not anger, not quite. Determination. The face he made when he was deciding something. 2 rooms, he said. And a proper floor. And a bigger bookshelf. Yes. Anything else you've been meaning to mention? Charlotte considered the list she'd been building in her mind, the wolf problem in the north pasture, the drainage issue near the barn that would get worse as the ranch expanded, the question of whether they should consider buying the adjacent 20 acres that old Perkins had been talking about selling before his arthritis got any worse. Quite a lot, she said, but it can wait until tomorrow. We've got time. It was the first time she'd said that and believed it entirely. We've got time. Not rushing against winter, not fighting for survival, not counting the days until the next crisis. Just time. Actual, real time to build things in. The cabin came into view, dark except for the banked fire glow through the window. Small and crooked and insufficient and entirely, stubbornly theirs. Elias brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down, and then did something he'd never done before. Reached up to help Charlotte down, not because she needed help, but because it was a gesture. A small one. The kind that didn't mean anything by itself, but meant everything as part of a pattern. She took his hand and stepped down, and they stood for a moment in the dark yard listening to the night. Thank you, she said. For what? Charlotte thought about the fence posts in wet snow and the broken thermometer, and the cough she'd spent a winter nursing, and the 6 women who'd committed to a cooperative that didn't exist yet. She thought about the barn cat named Josephine and the calf named Walter and the bookshelf that was already too small for what she intended to put in it. For building something worth building in, she said. Elias was quiet for a beat. Then, thank you for making it worth building. Neither of them was good at the kind of thing people in novels said to each other. Neither of them had been built for elegance or sentiment. But standing in the October dark outside the cabin that leaked and the barn that housed 3 cats and 23 chickens and a calf with a name, Charlotte Whitmore Boone thought that perhaps elegance was overrated. Perhaps what mattered was just saying the true thing, however plainly, and trusting the other person to hear it for what it was. They went inside. She rebuilt the fire. He checked the animals one last time. They moved through the small cabin with the ease of 2 people who'd learned each other's habits and accommodated them without discussion. The particular choreography of a shared life. The bookshelf stood against the east wall, overflowing. Someday it would be a library wall. The children would grow up reading from it, and the ranch would triple in size, and the cooperative Charlotte had started would change the economics of the whole valley. All of that was coming. But tonight, Charlotte took down the Tennyson and sat by the fire, and Elias sat across from her mending a harness strap, and she read to him about things that endured, and neither of them said anything about what they were building because they both already knew. The cooperative came together the way most useful things came together. Imperfectly, slowly, with a great deal of arguing in a cold room. Charlotte had spent October and November of 1886 writing letters, drafting proposals, and riding out to neighboring ranches with Elias on days when the weather permitted. The first formal meeting of what she was calling the Cutter's Ridge Agricultural Cooperative happened in Margaret Chen's boarding house dining room on a Tuesday in late November, with 11 ranching families represented, and a fire in the hearth that wasn't quite adequate for the number of bodies crowded around the tables. Ruth Halverson sat at Charlotte's right, which Charlotte had come to understand was Ruth's way of signaling support without making a speech about it. Tom Wu sat near the back, listening. Caldwell, the banker, had not been invited. His manager Reeves had, and he sat near the door with his hat in his lap and the expression of a man who understood he was observing something he didn't yet know how to categorize. Charlotte stood up and explained the cooperative model the way she'd explained everything that year, without performance, without apology, just laying out the facts in sequence because the facts were sufficient. Individual ranchers selling eggs, wool, and dairy products to merchants negotiated from weakness. Each seller was replaceable. But if 11 ranches, representing combined production that made them one of the largest agricultural suppliers in the territory, approached buyers collectively, the calculus changed. Buyers needed them more than any individual seller needed any individual buyer. "We set minimum prices," Charlotte said, drawing on the chalkboard Margaret had provided. "We set quality standards. We share weather information and livestock health reports so disease doesn't spread through ignorance. We pool small purchases, seed, equipment, lumber, and buy at volume discount." "What happens to ranches that don't join?" a man named Peters asked from the back. He was large and skeptical, and had a reputation for doing things exactly as he'd always done them and daring the world to suggest otherwise. "Nothing. They continue as before." Charlotte met his eyes. "But when the cooperative negotiates a better price from Denver buyers, that price applies to cooperative members. Non-members continue to take whatever price they're offered. That's pressure to join. That's market incentive. There's a difference." Charlotte didn't blink. "You're welcome to decline and continue negotiating alone. I'm offering you the option of not doing that." Peters grumbled. He joined in December. The cooperative wasn't a miracle. Charlotte had never expected it to be. In its first year, it saved member ranches an average of 6% on supply purchases and secured a wool price 11% above what individual sellers had gotten the previous season. 6% sounded small until you applied it to a budget where every dollar fought for its life. 11% on wool was the difference between a family eating well through winter and a family making cuts. Word spread. By spring of 1887, 17 families had joined. By fall, 22. Charlotte was elected secretary of the cooperative, a title that sounded modest and came with the actual work of corresponding with buyers, maintaining records, and writing the quarterly reports that kept members informed about collective finances. She did this work at the kitchen table in the hours before dawn, when the ranch was quiet and the lamp burned and she could think without interruption. She kept writing for the Agricultural Journal, too. The editor had started expecting her contributions. She wrote about cold climate planting schedules, about poultry management in extreme weather, about the economics of small-scale cooperative marketing. She wrote without pretension, in the plain style she'd developed from years of writing letters that needed to accomplish something. The money was not significant, never more than $20 a year, but the letters that came in response mattered more than the money. Women from Wyoming, from the Dakotas, from Minnesota, writing to ask specific questions about specific problems. Women who were doing what Charlotte had done, arriving somewhere difficult without adequate preparation and figuring it out day by day. She answered every letter. In 1888, Elias bought the adjacent 20 acres from old Perkins, who'd finally decided his arthritis had earned him a retirement in his daughter's home in Oregon. They bought it with money Charlotte had set aside systematically over 2 years. A small amount each month, recorded in the ledger, accumulating with the patience of someone who understood that the future was built in installments. "You've been saving without telling me," Elias said when she showed him the account. I told you I was setting aside for land expansion. You said you were thinking about it. In my vocabulary, thinking about it means I'm already doing it and will tell you when it's done. Charlotte put the ledger away. Were you going to stop me? No, he admitted. I just would have liked to know. Now you know. We own 60 acres. He went out to walk the new land that afternoon, alone, which Charlotte understood was his way of processing things that moved him. He came back at dusk with mud on his boots and something settled in his expression. This is enough to run a real cattle operation, he said. Yes. We'd need to hire properly, not just Jack and Tom occasionally. Yes. I've been thinking about that too. Charlotte set dinner on the table. Actual dinner, not beans, though beans had never entirely disappeared from the rotation. Jack Brennan wants steady work. His family's claim north of here isn't viable. The soil's poor and his father's not well. If we offered him proper wages and a place to sleep in the new addition, we'd get reliable labor and he'd get stability. You've already talked to him. I mentioned that we might be expanding. He mentioned that steady work would suit him. It was a mutual mentioning. She sat down. Tom's different. He has his own claim and doesn't want to give it up, and I wouldn't ask him to, but he'd consult. He'd advise that knowledge is worth paying for. Elias served himself and ate in silence for a moment. Outside, the September wind was just starting to develop the edge that signaled autumn coming. They'd learned to read that edge as both warning and promise. The cold was coming, which meant hard work ahead, which meant they'd survived another summer, which meant they'd earned the right to face another winter. When did you become the one making the business decisions? Elias asked. Not accusatory, genuinely curious. Somewhere around the first blizzard, Charlotte said. When I realized that surviving required thinking 6 months ahead instead of 6 days. You're better at the physical work than I am. I'm better at the planning. We stopped pretending otherwise a long time ago. I don't just let you run things because you're better at planning. He looked at her. I trust you. That's different. Charlotte set down her fork. I know, she said quietly. I know it is. The house had changed by then. The 2-room addition Elias had proposed that October night the previous year had been completed in the spring, raising the cabin from 4 rooms to 6. The floor had been properly raised and laid with actual wood planks. The windows were glass, real glass, without cracks. The roof had been replaced with good timber and sealed properly, and it hadn't leaked since. The bookshelf had become a wall. Elias had built it over 2 weekends in the spring, muttering about the number of books that kept arriving in the post, while Charlotte had stood beside him directing the precise spacing of the shelves with a focus that he'd tolerated with the patience of a man who understood that the battle over shelf spacing was not one he was going to win. The books filled it within a year, floor to ceiling, organized by Charlotte in a system that made sense only to her, not alphabetical, not by subject exactly, but by some interior logic that mapped how she thought. Elias could never find anything without asking her. She could find anything in 30 seconds in the dark. You need more shelves, he said in the fall of 1889. I need more wall, Charlotte said. They're different problems. He built her more wall the following spring, extending the main room by 12 feet, which finally gave the cabin the proportions of an actual house. The addition also meant a proper dining room separate from the kitchen, a luxury Charlotte hadn't let herself want out loud until she'd figured out they could afford it. Their first child, a daughter, was born in March of 1889. They named her Frances, after Charlotte's mother. Frances arrived 4 weeks early and weighed considerably less than she should have, and the first 3 months of her life were a quiet terror that Charlotte managed by applying the same systematic focus she'd brought to chickens and account books and cooperative marketing, tracking every feeding, every temperature, every small sign of progress or concern. Elias was wrecked by it in a way he couldn't articulate and didn't try to. He spent those months working harder than usual, which was already very hard, and checking on the baby every hour through the night in a way he thought Charlotte didn't notice. She noticed. Frances survived and then thrived and then became the particular kind of small person who seemed to have arrived with opinions fully formed. By the time she was 2, she was following Charlotte through the chicken coop with a proprietary air and attempting to name every animal on the property with a determination her mother found both familiar and slightly exhausting. She learned that from you, Elias said, watching Frances attempt to pet one of the barn cats. Not Josephine, who'd died the previous winter, but two of Josephine's descendants, who'd inherited her general attitude toward the world. She learned it from observation, Charlotte said. That's different from teaching. Is it? When you teach something, you know the lesson. When you learn by observing, you understand the principle. She watched Frances carefully offering a piece of bread to a cat who was absolutely going to take it and then bite her anyway. I want her to understand the principle. The principle of naming things. The principle of caring about what's in front of you, of paying attention. Charlotte caught Frances before the cat incident could conclude badly. You can pet her like this, not like that. Slower. Frances adjusted her approach with the seriousness of a 2-year-old engaged in important scientific work. The cat tolerated it for approximately 4 seconds before retreating under the hay bale with her dignity intact. Again, Frances said. Tomorrow, Charlotte said. That's enough for today. Again. Tomorrow, Frances. Frances looked at her mother with an expression that Elias had started calling the Charlotte face, the flat-eyed, immovable look that preceded either perfect reasonableness or complete intractability, and you never knew which until it arrived. Tomorrow, Frances agreed eventually. A son came in 1891, named William after Elias's father. Where Frances had been early and uncertain, William arrived on schedule and loud, with the constitution of someone who intended to stick around and had decided to announce it immediately. He grew fast, ate constantly, and attached himself to Elias's work on the cattle with an intensity that bordered on monomania. By the time William was 4, he was getting underfoot in the barn with the practiced confidence of a child who knew the animals would tolerate him because they always had. Elias taught him the cattle the way Charlotte had been taught, not by simplifying, but by explaining the real thing, trusting the child to grow into the understanding. A second daughter, Helen, arrived in 1894, quiet and observant where her siblings were loud and active. Helen was the one who sat beside Charlotte at the table watching her work on correspondence and cooperative accounts. The one who asked questions that required actual answers, not reassurances. By the time she was 5, she was doing simple addition in the margins of Charlotte's notebooks. She's going to be smarter than both of us, Elias said once, watching Helen work through a problem she'd assigned herself. Good, Charlotte said. She'll need to be. The world she inherits is going to be more complicated than the one we walked into. The ranch grew because they worked it with intelligence, not just effort. By 1895, they were running 120 cattle, maintaining the cooperative that had expanded to 38-member families, and Charlotte was corresponding with an agricultural college in the East that had written asking if she'd be willing to contribute an extended piece on cooperative marketing for small-scale Western ranchers. She wrote the piece over 3 months, working at dawn while the ranch woke around her. It ran to 40 pages. The college published it as a pamphlet and distributed it to extension offices across 5 territories. Charlotte received a copy in the mail and set it on the bookshelf between Tennyson and a practical guide to soil chemistry that she'd ordered from a catalog and read 3 times. She didn't make a production of it. Neither did Elias, though she'd noticed him showing the pamphlet to Tom Wu with the studied casualness of a man who was proud and didn't know how to say so directly. Tom had read it carefully, the way he read everything. This is good, he'd said, which from Tom was equivalent to a standing ovation. By 1900, the debt was gone. The final payment to the bank, to Reeves, who'd replaced Caldwell and turned out to be genuinely reasonable in a way Caldwell never had been, happened on a Thursday in February, 15 years after Charlotte had signed that terrifying document acknowledging that everything could be taken away. Elias brought home the deed, marked paid in full, and set it on the table. Charlotte looked at it for a long time without touching it. Pick it up, Elias said. She picked it up. The paper was heavier than it should have been. 60 acres, she said. 60 acres, clear. No debt. No debt. He sat down across from her, and she could see that he was moved in the particular way he'd always been moved by things that mattered. Quietly, without drama, just a slight softening around the eyes and a quality of stillness. 3 kids, a library wall, and 22 years of not giving up. 23 in October, Charlotte corrected. Right. She set the deed down. Outside, February was doing what it always did, making threats, keeping the temperature honest. Frances was in the new barn Elias had built in 1897, doing the morning feeding with the systematic efficiency she'd inherited from Charlotte and the physical ease she'd gotten from years of doing this work. William was checking fence with Jack Brennan, who'd become so integrated into the operation that calling him hired help felt dishonest. He was something closer to family, awkward and loyal, and still slightly nervous around Charlotte, which she'd given up trying to fix. Helen was at the kitchen table doing mathematics before breakfast, because that was simply what Helen did. "Are you happy?" Elias asked. Charlotte looked up from the deed. He didn't ask that kind of question, not because he didn't think about those things, but because he communicated them differently, through what he built and what he fixed and how he listened when she read in the evenings. The question, asked plainly on a February morning with the deed on the table between them, was startling in its directness. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "I've been happy for a while. Didn't want to say so in case it was bad luck." He reached across the table and picked up the deed again. "Out here, you learn to be superstitious about the good things." "That's ridiculous." "I know, but you also know exactly what I mean." She did. She'd felt it herself. The hesitation to name contentment out loud, because out here, the land heard you and the weather answered, and the answer wasn't always kind. It was irrational. She believed it anyway, in the practical, unsentimental way she'd come to believe all the things Montana had taught her. That spring, Tom Wu died. He went quietly, in his sleep, in the small house he'd built on his claim 30 years before. He was 71, and he'd spent those 30 years paying attention to one specific piece of earth in one specific climate, and his knowledge had kept more families alive through more difficult seasons than anyone had properly tallied. Charlotte wrote his obituary for the Cutter's Ridge Gazette. She wrote it the way she'd learned to write everything, without decoration, without the false sentiment that obituaries usually deployed to smooth over the fact of death. She wrote about what Tom Wu actually knew, and what that knowledge had meant, and what the valley had lost. The editor printed it exactly as she'd written it, which she later heard was the first time in 15 years he hadn't changed a word. Elias didn't talk much about Tom after the funeral. He went out to the north fence, the section Tom had always warned needed reinforcing, and spent a day and a half replacing posts. Charlotte let him do it without comment. Some grief was physical. Some loss needed to be carried in the body, in the work. The children grew and changed and became people Charlotte could only partially recognize as the babies she'd known. Francis, at 18, was running the cooperative's financial records with a precision that had made Charlotte redundant in that particular role within a year. She had her mother's systematic mind and her father's stubbornness, and neither of their interest in being told what to do by anyone. She was also, at 19, in a fierce and complicated courtship with a young man from a ranching family, 3 valleys over, which Charlotte observed with the detached fascination of someone watching weather develop on the horizon. "You approve of him?" Elias asked one evening. "I approve of how she talks to him, like she means what she says and expects the same back." Charlotte set her sewing down. "That's all you can really ask." "She's too young. She's the same age I was when I was desperate enough to answer a mail-order bride advertisement." Elias went quiet. "That's not the same." "No, it's better. She's choosing from strength, not desperation. That's the whole point of everything we built." Charlotte picked up her sewing again. "The point wasn't the ranch. It was that our children get to make choices we didn't have." William went to an agricultural college in 1909, the first person in either of their families to attend higher education. He came back 2 years later with ideas about soil management and crop rotation that were both earnest and slightly condescending about what he assumed his parents didn't know. "He thinks we've been farming wrong," Elias told Charlotte after one particularly enthusiastic dinner conversation. "He's read more recent research than we have. Some of what he's saying is right." Charlotte had actually looked through William's textbooks. "Not all of it applies to our specific conditions, but the soil chemistry information is useful." "You're not annoyed that he's telling us how to run our own land?" "I'm slightly annoyed, but being annoyed doesn't make him wrong." She closed the textbook. "He learned to think critically from watching us. Now he's applying it to us. That's exactly how it's supposed to work." Elias considered this. "When did you get wise?" "February 1886. I've been refining it since." Helen did something neither of them had anticipated. She wrote to the agricultural college that had published Charlotte's pamphlet, and then to 2 others, and then to a women's college in the East, and spent 3 years in correspondence before being admitted to a program in botany at 20. She left Montana on a train, carrying a sensible bag and a look of absolute calm that Charlotte recognized as the face of someone who'd made a decision and was done second-guessing it. Charlotte stood on the platform at Cutter's Ridge, which had grown in 25 years from 7 buildings to 43, with a proper station and a hotel and 2 churches and a school, and watched Helen's train pull away and felt something that took her a while to identify. Pride was part of it, the simpler part. The rest was harder to name. It was the recognition that everything you built eventually walked away from you on its own legs, which was exactly the point, which didn't make watching it go any easier. "She'll be fine," Elias said, standing beside her. "I know." Charlotte didn't take her eyes from the tracks until the train was entirely gone. "That's not what I'm thinking about." "What are you thinking about?" "That I got here on a train just like that one. Terrified, with no idea what was coming." She finally turned away from the empty tracks. "And now I'm standing here watching my daughter leave on a train to go get the education I never had, to do work I couldn't have imagined, and the only thing she's afraid of is that she might not be good enough. Not that the world won't let her try." Elias was quiet. He was good at that, at letting her thoughts land without rushing to fill the space. "That's the whole thing, isn't it?" Charlotte said. It wasn't quite a question. "That's what the last 25 years were for." "Yeah," he said. "I think so." They walked back through a town Charlotte had come to know better than she'd ever known Boston. She knew the names of people 3 generations deep. She knew which families were struggling and which were stable. She knew the cooperative's current membership of 42 families and the challenges of the current drought cycle, and which pastures had good grass and which needed resting. She knew this land the way you could only know something you'd fought for. Not abstractly, not academically, in the body, in the hands. The drought of 1910 was the worst in 30 years, the worst since Tom Wu had warned about the flood of 1886, in a way, a full reversal of that disaster, this time the water refusing to come instead of refusing to leave. The cooperative mobilized in ways it had never needed to before. Charlotte coordinated with buyers in 3 cities to smooth out the price crashes that happened when distressed ranchers had to sell livestock they couldn't feed. She arranged collective purchases of supplemental feed at prices that individual ranchers couldn't have accessed. She wrote letters to territorial government officials about disaster relief with the flat, precise authority of someone who'd been corresponding with institutions for 20 years and had no patience for being ignored. Some ranches didn't make it. 4 families in the cooperative, despite everything, left the valley, sold what they could, went somewhere else to start over. Charlotte attended the farewell gatherings and said the right things and felt the weight of their going in her chest for weeks after. "We couldn't save everyone," Elias said. "I know." Charlotte set down her pen. She'd been drafting a letter to the remaining cooperative families about a mutual aid fund for the following year. "That doesn't make it easier." "No. But 42 families didn't have to become 38. It could have been 20. He was right. It usually could have been worse. That was both comfort and insufficient. The drought broke in 1911 with rain so generous, they briefly threatened flooding before settling into exactly what the land needed. The grass came back. The herds rebuilt. The 4 families who'd left didn't return. Life didn't work like that. But the valley absorbed the gap and continued. By 1912, the ranch had been operating for 27 years. It was unrecognizable from the 40 acres of debt and dirt that Charlotte had arrived at in 1885. 120 acres now, properly fenced with iron posts throughout. A house that had accumulated rooms and improvements over decades, until it bore no meaningful resemblance to the original cabin, though Elias had kept one section of the original log wall exposed in the main room, insisting it stay. Charlotte had argued about it twice, and then stopped because she understood what it meant to him, where they'd started, what it had cost to get from there to here. The bookshelf had become a library wall that had become a library room. Actual room, dedicated purpose, floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls and a reading chair in the corner that had replaced 3 previous chairs over the years as each wore out. Charlotte still organized it in her system that only she fully understood, and the children had all grown up navigating it by asking her where things were, which she considered an entirely satisfactory arrangement. Elias's cough had come back in his 60s. A different thing now, not the winter illness of 1886, but the deeper settling of decades of cold and hard work in a man's lungs. The doctor in Cutter's Ridge, there was a doctor now, and had been for 15 years, had told him what it was with the directness of a man who respected his patient enough to be honest. "How long?" Elias had asked. "Depends on how you take care of yourself." "I've never been good at that." "Your wife might have opinions." Charlotte had very specific opinions. She managed his cough the way she managed everything, systematically, without pretending it wasn't serious, without making it the center of every conversation. She adjusted what she could adjust, and accepted what she couldn't, and refused to spend the time they had left treating him like he was already gone. He worked less, but never entirely stopped. There was always something on a ranch that needed doing, and Elias Boone was constitutionally incapable of standing still while it needed doing. Charlotte stopped fighting it as a matter of medical principle, and started instead directing his energy toward work that was productive and not likely to kill him faster than necessary. He built things. He'd always built things, but in his last years he built with a different quality of attention. The bookshelf editions for the grandchildren's books, a small outbuilding for Francis's eldest who'd come to work the ranch, improvements to the barn that William had designed and Elias had refined because theory and practice weren't the same thing, and Elias knew the practice. He built a bench for the front of the house, facing west, overlooking the pasture and the mountains beyond. He built it without explanation. Charlotte knew it was for sitting together in the evenings when the work allowed it, watching the light change over the mountains in that particular Montana way, the sky going through a sequence of colors that Charlotte had long since stopped trying to describe in words, because words weren't adequate for it. They sat there often, in the years that remained, not always talking, sometimes reading, Charlotte with a book, Elias with whatever he was currently working through at his own pace, which was slower than hers and always had been and had never been a problem. Sometimes watching the weather come in over the mountains with the experienced eyes of people who'd read that sky for 30 years. Sometimes just sitting, which Charlotte had learned was its own form of communication between people who'd been together long enough to have said most of the important things. "I've been thinking about what we got wrong," Elias said one evening. They were on the bench, the mountains going amber in the late light. Charlotte looked up from her book. "Which thing specifically?" "There's a list." "The letters. The line at the beginning." He was looking at the mountains. "I've thought about it a lot over the years. Whether it was a terrible foundation to build on." "You've never mentioned thinking about it." "I've thought about a lot of things I haven't mentioned." He turned to look at her. "You know that." "I do." Charlotte closed the book. "What did you conclude?" "That the lies were terrible and also completely irrelevant by about the third month." He looked back at the mountains. "The lies are what got us both here. Everything real happened after we arrived and discovered what we'd done. The lies were the door. We built the house ourselves." Charlotte considered that. It was the kind of thing Elias said rarely, a complete thought, worked out over years, offered carefully. "I think the lies almost don't matter anymore," she said. "What matters is what we chose after. Every day, choosing to stay and work and build instead of retreating." She opened her book again. "That was the real thing, not the letters." "Yeah." He turned back to the mountains. "That's what I concluded too." The cough got worse in the winter of 1915. Charlotte knew by then how to distinguish between the coughs that were temporary and the cough that was something else. She'd known for 2 years. So had Elias, she suspected, though neither of them had said it explicitly, which was their way. Not avoidance exactly, but the understanding that naming a thing and knowing a thing were different, and you could know something and still live fully in its presence without needing to perform the knowing constantly. Francis was running the cooperative by then. Charlotte had formally handed it over 3 years before. After the drought, when she'd assessed the situation with the clear eye, she'd always tried to bring to things and determined that her daughter's energy and her own experience were more valuable in combination than either was separately. Francis took it and ran it with the efficiency of someone who'd grown up watching it built from nothing and therefore understood both its purpose and its mechanics. William managed the ranch's day-to-day operations with input from Jack Brennan, who was 50 now and as reliable as the fence posts he'd been replacing for nearly 3 decades. Helen wrote from the East, long, detailed letters about her botanical research, about the institution where she worked, about the students she taught with the same patient directness Charlotte had brought to teaching her. The grandchildren were everywhere. 6 of them, ranging in age from 3 to 14, with the particular chaos that children bring to a house that had once been very quiet. Charlotte had adjusted to the chaos the way she'd adjusted to everything Montana had thrown at her, by figuring out what she could control and making peace with what she couldn't, and finding, to her surprise, that she loved the noise in a way she hadn't expected. Elias had a quality with the grandchildren that he'd never quite managed to deploy with adults, a directness without condescension, a seriousness about their concerns that they recognized and responded to. He told them things straight, without baby talk or false comfort, and they trusted him for it. The oldest grandchild, Francis's daughter Ruth, named for Ruth Halverson, who died in 1905 and deserved the naming, was 14 and had her great-grandmother's accounting mind and her grandmother's stubbornness, and was already corresponding with Helen about educational possibilities. "She wants to be a scientist," Francis told Charlotte. "Then let her be a scientist," Charlotte said. "It's not easy for women." It wasn't easy to move to Montana in 1885 with $17 and a lace parasol. Charlotte was at her correspondence desk, where she still sat every morning despite technically having handed off most of her responsibilities. "Easy is not the metric. Possible is the metric." Frances smiled, her mother's exact smile, which Charlotte could never quite get used to seeing on someone else's face. "I'll tell her you said so. Tell her I'll write letters of introduction to the college in Philadelphia if she wants them. I've been corresponding with the dean there for 12 years. He owes me a consideration or two. The last summer was like all the Montana summers, relentless and beautiful and demanding in ways that didn't negotiate." Elias worked less, sat on the bench more, watched the mountains with the focused attention of a man cataloging something he wanted to keep. He read more, slowly, in his patient way, working through books Charlotte recommended with the thoroughness of someone who'd taught himself to read and therefore never took the activity lightly. He died in October, the same month Charlotte had arrived in Montana 30 years before. It was the kind of symmetry that meant nothing and felt like it meant everything. Charlotte was with him, which was what mattered. Not at the end of some dramatic crisis, not in the barn in 40 below darkness, just in the house, in the morning, when the thing that had been coming for 2 years finally arrived. She sat with him for a while after. Not crying, she'd cried already over the previous months, in the practical way she did most things, deliberately, completely, and then finished. Now she just sat and looked at the man who'd written letters full of lies and built something true, and thought about all the things they'd argued about, and all the things they'd built, and all the things they'd sat on the bench watching without saying anything at all. The valley came to the funeral. Not 43 people like the harvest festival of her first year. Hundreds. 3 generations of families whose ranches had survived in part because of the cooperative Charlotte had started with 6 tentative commitments in a cold room 30 years ago. People who'd known Elias as the lonely rancher who somehow, inexplicably, had sent east for a wife and gotten something that transformed the entire valley's economy. People who'd watched them build and fight and persist through drought and flood and market crashes and the ordinary daily grind that wore most people down. Ruth Halverson's daughter gave a speech. It was about Elias, but it was also about what 2 people could build when they stopped pretending and started working. About what the valley owed to the particular stubbornness of a man who'd stayed when he should have failed, and a woman who'd stayed when she could have run. Charlotte sat in the front and listened and didn't speak because what was there to say that 30 years hadn't already said better? She lived another 12 years after Elias died, not quietly. That had never been her way. She kept writing, kept corresponding, kept working with Francis on the cooperative until Francis's own children were old enough to take it over. She answered letters from women across the country who'd read her pamphlet or her articles and were trying to figure out their own impossible situations. She sat on the bench in the evenings, alone now, but not empty, the mountains still doing their thing with the light, indifferent and magnificent. She read poetry on winter nights, aloud, the way she always had. To herself now, but the habit had never been about audience. It had been about the words themselves, about the human need to name things that were larger than ordinary language. Helen came home in the summers. William was always there, always working, always finding something that needed building or fixing or improving with the inexhaustible energy of a man who'd inherited his father's inability to stand still. Francis ran everything with the calm efficiency of someone who'd grown up watching how it was supposed to be done. The library wall had been extended twice more. Charlotte organized it still, in her system that only she understood. On a clear September morning in 1927, Charlotte Whitmore Boone sat on the bench Elias had built and looked at the mountains and thought about a train pulling into a ramshackle station and a woman in a green silk dress holding a ruined parasol. That woman had been terrified and broke and full of lies and completely unprepared for what was coming. What was coming had nearly killed her, had changed her in every way a person could be changed, had taken everything she'd thought she was and replaced it with something harder and more useful and more honest. She hadn't become a different person. She'd become the real one, after all the false versions had been stripped away by cold and necessity and the daily choice to stay. The lesson, if there was one, and Charlotte had always been skeptical of tidy lessons, wasn't that love conquers all, or that hard work guarantees success, or that two liars could make an honest life. Those were too clean, too neat for what had actually happened. The real thing, the thing she'd carry to the end, was simpler and harder than any of those. You showed up. You were honest about what you didn't know. You learned. You stayed when leaving was easier. You built things with whoever was willing to build them with you. And you argued about the details, and you were wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and you kept going regardless. That was it. That was the whole of it. The mountains sat where they'd always sat, patient and enormous and entirely uninterested in what any of it meant. The grass moved in the September wind. Somewhere in the barn, Francis's youngest was doing the morning feeding with the automatic ease of a child who'd grown up doing it, the way Charlotte had once watched Elias do everything with the automatic ease of someone who'd learned it the hard way. The ranch breathed around her, alive with the sounds of work and animals and family. Charlotte closed her eyes and felt the sun on her face and thought that 30 years ago she'd stood on a train platform in the worst moment of her life, holding a ruined parasol, looking at a broken-down man and a broken-down cabin, and somehow that had been the beginning of everything, not the end of something. The beginning. She'd never quite gotten over the improbability of it, the sheer blind luck and stubbornness and accident that had put two desperate lying people in a leaking cabin together and let them figure out that what they had was enough to build on, if they were willing to do the building. The wind shifted the way it always did in September, carrying the first cold edge of the winter that was coming. Charlotte opened her eyes. The mountains were still there. The sky was still that particular shade of blue that didn't exist anywhere else she'd ever been. She got up from the bench, smoothed her dress, practical wool now, not silk, not for 30 years, and went inside to answer her letters. There was always more work to do. That had been true from the first day, and it was true now, and it would be true when she was gone and Francis's children were doing it and their children after them. The work didn't end. You just handed it to the next set of hands and trusted that they'd carry it forward. Charlotte Whitmore Boone picked up her pen. She had 12 letters waiting, and the morning light was good, and she had things to say.
Yeah, like your family. My whole family is alive. Is this guy okay? There's something wrong with this guy. What is he even talking about? And you're dead again. Yeah, like your family. Is he okay? Hey James, I'm bored. Let's show our hole. No, you don't want that.
It's always Merlin, bro. Merlin a freak in every chat.
Merlin, yeah. Kind of respect that. Just because I'm significantly more chopped than Zorilla doesn't stop him from also coming here and telling me to show my butthole.
You have a mustache, bro.
You think? Why is Merlin freaky as fuck? Merlin a freak. Freaky deaky. No one want my freakiness. It's the like flirting versus sexual harassment thing.
Somebody gonna match my freak?
Somebody going to match my nasty.
Let me match my nasty, please.